Chapter 2555. All new Night Division. Lorraine nodded to Shifeng's request and promptly left to retrieve the relevant information. After a short moment, the senior administrator returned with a thick book, placing it on the table before him. "There's so many?" Shifeng asked, glancing down at the tome. Lorraine had only given him a sheet of paper during his last visit when he had requested to see his Night Division's recruitment status. Yet now she had an entire book for him. Normally, if there were fewer than 30,000 applicants, players would only be given a sheet of paper. They'd receive another sheet for every 10,000 applicants beyond that and would only receive a complete book once more than 100,000 NPCs applied for their Night Division. Shifeng had already recruited NPCs from many NPC cities, and could reasonably assume he had accepted or rejected most interested NPCs. Hence he shouldn't see too many more new applications. Receiving another 50,000 would be a miracle, and yet more than 100,000 new NPCs had applied. Initially, Lord Bronze Legatee, you hadn't received many applicants. However, due to the large number of other races visiting Stone Forest City, the number of interested individuals has considerably increased, Lorraine explained. The Freedom City title's benefits have taken effect so soon? The explanation stunned Shifeng. He had thought he'd have to wait a few more days before the title took effect. He had just promoted Stone Forest City and assumed the system would make him wait. However, it seemed that he had somewhat underestimated the new title. A total of 112,672 people have applied to serve as your knights. Among them, 83,241 are human, 27,412 are Orcish, 1,836 are elven, and 183 are giants. This book has the records of all of these applicants' information, Lorraine continued, ignoring Shifeng's muttering. Nearly 30,000 NPCs from other races? If the superpowers of the past found out about this, wouldn't they go mad? Shifeng could not help his growing excitement. Recruiting NPCs from other races for their Night Divisions was incredibly difficult for players. The other races had smaller populations than humans. Normally, the various superpowers would be overjoyed if even several thousand non-human NPCs applied to serve as knights. And yet Shifeng had nearly 30,000 of these applicants, certainly a frightening number. Not even a 2-star lord might receive so many throughout a full year. Most importantly, elves and giants had applied in considerably large numbers. The situation had completely exceeded his expectations. In God's domain, the Orcish population was only second to the humans. Ors typically made up the majority of non-human NPC applicants. Of course, that didn't discount Or Knight's strength. On the contrary, Or NPCs were quite powerful. They were natural-born warriors with sharp senses and robust frames that were far superior to humans. Excluding heroes, human fighters were no match for Or fighters of the same level and tier. The human race's superior research and creativity were the reason that Ors weren't a match for humans and forced to live far from the main continent's fertile lands. However, if one could assemble the Ors scattered across the continent and form a melee unit, the force would be absolutely unstoppable in battle. Shaking off his shock, Shifeng immediately inspected the recruitment list. When he had arrived, he had only planned to recruit new knights with high growth potential to replace some of his weaker NPCs, but now he had many more changes to make to his Night Division. Time flew by, and without taking a break, Shifeng had spent over 20 hours browsing the recruitment list. He was more focused on the list than he was during boss fights. Thankfully, I brought plenty of coins with me. Otherwise, I wouldn't even have enough to pay the dismissal fees. Shifeng revealed a bitter smile as he finished reading the list. If things had gone according to his original plan, he would have only been able to replace a small fraction of his Night Division's members. But now that he could recruit non-human NPCs which would be bound to him for life, things had changed. Once he recruited non-human NPCs, he couldn't dismiss or replace them. Hence, he had to be extremely careful when choosing non-human knights. Fortunately, non-human NPCs were much cheaper to recruit and maintain than human NPCs. They were generally 30% cheaper. All things considered, it wasn't a bad transaction. Moreover, non-human NPCs tended to be quite talented. In fact, more than half of the non-human NPCs in God's domain were Bronze Knight standard or above, which was one of the reasons that the various powers of the past had preferred non-human NPCs. Of the 27,412 Ors that had applied to join Shifeng's Night Division, 15,123 were Tier 2 Bronze Knights. The ratio was unheard of among human NPCs. However, it was quite normal with ores. Many Tier 3 ores had also sent in applications, and they all had considerably high potential. Even the weakest among them was at the mysterious Iron Standard, while 45 were at the Secret Silver Standard, and 1 Fine Gold Standard or had applied. The Elven and Giant applicants were just as shocking. Elves were natural-born mages with higher growth potential than most races. Even the weakest elf that applied was Bronze rank, while as many as 43 were Secret Silver rank and 2 were Fine Gold rank. Moreover, every elf applicant was Tier 3. Although Giants made up the majority of applicants, with only 183, 13 were Tier 3 Secret Silver Knights, and 1 was a Tier 3 Fine Gold Knight. More than 100 Secret Silver and Fine Gold ranked non-human NPCs had applied to Shifeng's Knight Division, many times more than those among the 80,000-plus human applicants. Lord Bronze Legatee, have you made your decision? Lorraine asked when Shifeng closed the book. I want all knights with Secret Silver potential and above. I also want these mysterious Iron Knights with high growth potential and the remaining Tier 3 Knights, Shifeng replied, nodding. Normally, an NPC knight needed at least mysterious iron growth potential before they could be promoted to Tier 3. Even in the later stages of God's domain, Tier 3 NPCs would be considered a powerful force. After all, very few players could reach Tier 4. Even if they did, a group of Tier 3 NPCs, backed by a city's magic array, wouldn't be an easy opponent. If enough Tier 3 NPCs formed a battle array, they could slay Tier 4 players. This was why, even after reaching Tier 4, players could only afford to act conceited in the fields. Very well. There are 152 applicants with Secret Silver potential or above. Including the rest, there are a total of 326 Tier 3 Knights. Calculating the recruitment fee of the 1,872 Tier 3 Mysterious Iron Knights with high potential and some of your current Knights' dismissal fees, your bill comes to 554,600 gold, Lorraine explained after taking a moment to tally his total. Please include the promotion fees for the 437 members of my Knight Division, Shifeng said. Giving the matter some thought, he continued, I also want to outfit my Tier 3 Knights with epic equipment. How much will that come to? That will raise the price considerably. If we include the 437 people that will be promoted to Tier 3, you will need an additional 5,640,000 gold to arm all of your Tier 3 Knights with epic equipment. With the prior fees, your total comes to 6,198,970 gold, Lorraine responded, giving Shifeng a skeptical look. After giving the matter some more thought, Shifeng said, reduce the number slightly then. I'll take 1,150 sets. That won't be a problem. Your total will be 5,158,970 gold. Once we process the payment, the merchandise will be delivered within 3 hours. The new knights will arrive at your city lord's mansion within 1 hour, Lorraine calmly stated. Shifeng then nearly emptied his bag of coins, and in the blink of an eye he was once again a pauper. Nurturing a Knight Division really is expensive. It's no wonder why all of the superpowers that had Knight Divisions were poor, Shifeng muttered, bitterly smiling at the less than 3,000 gold in his bag. While Shifeng upgraded his Knight Division, in a remote canyon in the distant Cold Spring Forest, a group of black-clad magical class players chanted an incantation along the edge of a gigantic magic array. The array covered a 200-yard radius, and in its center stood an indifferent handsome youth with a night black crystal in his left hand, while writing a series of divine runes with his right. With each line of completed runes, a shard broke off of the crystal and disintegrated. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. When the crystal was nearly gone, the youth completed the final line of divine runes. Suddenly, the sky above the magic array split, and a colossal door dropped from the spatial tear. The door was over 100 meters tall and covered in ancient runes, radiating a mighty aura that made everyone nearby shudder. Once the door landed, it began to part down the middle. Excellent! It's complete! Flaming Light exclaimed as the door began to open. He then glanced at the middle-aged man standing nearby and said, Heart, notify the various powers and tell them that the door is open. Whether they cherish this opportunity or not is up to them. Understood. Furious Heart respectfully responded, crossing the threshold with his team. Chapter 2556, Crazy Freedom Hotel Cold Spring Forest, Stone Forest City. As news regarding Stone Forest City spread to more independent players, the number of small adventurer teams visiting the city continued to increase. Less than a day after the city's reopening, it had become somewhat crowded, and even more players had lined up to enter the city. A 6-man party of cloaked players, all radiating darkness energy, stood among the long line, and none of the nearby players even dared to take half a step closer to them. Those players' killing intent is so strong. Not even dark players who constantly slaughter others in the fields have such intense hostility. Who are those people? Their killing intent isn't the only thing that's intense. Look at their equipment. They might have concealed the glow effect, but all of their items are engraved with magic runes. Their equipment should be fine gold rank or higher. Level 105 fine gold equipment. Not even the various superpowers main force members necessarily have such top-tier items. Although the independent players nearby were afraid of the 6-man party, they couldn't help but envy the party's equipment. Ever since mainstream players had reached level 100, demand for level 100+ secret silver weapons and equipment had skyrocketed, but supply remained incredibly low. Thus, these items' prices had substantially increased. Not even ordinary expert players could afford level 100+ fine gold weapons or equipment. Even the various superpowers main force members would throw a party if they acquired just one such weapon or equipment piece. However, the weakest piece the 6-man party wore was level 105 fine gold rank, and all of their equipment bore magic runes. To ordinary players the equipment was divine. Despite noticing the surrounding players' envious looks, the members of the 6-man party didn't respond. I guess the main continent's ordinary experts don't amount to much. Not only do they have such poor weapons and equipment, but they don't even know about magic enhancement. Once the army has gathered, the Dark World will likely claim this area as new territory in the blink of an eye. A gray-clad, Tier 3 cursemancer with a military haircut disdainfully dismissed as he glanced at the independent experts around him. You shouldn't say such things, old Flash. After all, the environment in this area is no match for what we have in the Dark World. These players only have to worry about monsters in the fields, while we are always on the lookout for monster and player ambushes. It's only natural that our world's players have developed so much faster. A middle-aged, bearded man with simple features chided, chuckling. Besides, ordinary experts are just that. The various major powers experts are much stronger. Otherwise, our 2 guilds wouldn't have signed a non-interference pact with Zero Wing. I guess, but I still don't get why our guilds wanted to partner with Zero Wing in the first place. You must have seen how powerful that army was on our way here. How could Zero Wing possibly stop that kind of force? We shouldn't have a reason to pay Zero Wing 500,000 darkness crystals. The cursemancer named Magic Flash grumbled. 500,000 darkness crystals was no small price, even to their guilds. They certainly weren't worth a non-interference agreement from Zero Wing in their fight for resources in Cold Spring Forest. The only thing Zero Wing could do when facing the Dark World's countless players was hold inside the city. I don't know, but the higher-ups have their own reasons. We just need to complete the task they've assigned us, the middle-aged man said, shaking his head. In all honesty, the situation confused him too. The number of Dark World players preparing to invade Cold Spring Forest was no laughing matter. Several million players had already joined the invading army and more were on their way. News of the open pathway had just begun to spread, and it would take time for the information to reach the far corners of the Dark World. Based on their guild's estimates, the army should easily include tens of millions of players, possibly over 100 million. Not even the neighboring kingdoms and empires stood a chance against such a force, much less Zero Wing. The Dark World's army would definitely cause a massive commotion when it arrived on the main continent. While Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society's members conversed, they crossed Stone Forest City's gates. The mana here sure is dense. If Dark Rhapsody's guild cities had this much mana, we'd easily become the #1 guild in the Dark World. Magic Flash noticed, envious when he felt the mesmerizing mana in the air. It is certainly astonishing. It's no wonder why so many superpowers want this city, the bearded middle-aged man replied. What a pity. If Demon's Heart hadn't opened the Dark World's portal in Cold Spring Forest, Zero Wing might have become a massive threat to the various superpowers, Magic Flash said, glancing around at the crowd of players and NPC merchants. Seeing so many people, he more or less understood why his superiors had decided to ally with Zero Wing. Stone Forest City was no less prosperous than major NPC cities. With a guild city like this under its control, Zero Wing would have no worries about its development. Since Cold Spring Forest was a level 100 neutral map, every player here had a certain degree of strength. Including the conveniences the city offered, not only could Zero Wing continue to recruit and nurture more expert players, but its members' average levels would gradually surpass the various superpowers as well. Zero Wing definitely had the potential to become a titan in God's domain. Maybe, but we shouldn't dwell on it. We should hurry and contact Zero Wing. The sooner we get this done, the sooner we can return. If we wait and miss the invasion, it'll become more difficult to establish ourselves in Cold Spring Forest later, the middle-aged man cautioned. I've already contacted the guild. They said we should head toward the tallest building on the main street. Once we're there, someone will take us to meet their guild leader, Magic Flash said. You mean that building? The middle-aged man asked, pointing to the Freedom Hotel in the center of the city. Astonished, he continued, I'm impressed that Zero Wing managed to erect such a tall building. The tallest building either of our guilds has constructed is only a little over 50 meters tall, but that thing is at least 150. So what if it's tall? Someone is still going to take it from them, Magic Flash growled, sneering. The middle-aged man didn't try to refute Magic Flash's assumption. Such a tall building would only be useful for visual impact. Zero Wing would have been far better off spending its money to strengthen its members, in his opinion. Strength meant everything in God's domain. The cloaked players then made their way toward the hotel. They didn't take long to reach it, and when they did, they noticed a long line of players both inside and outside of the Freedom Hotel. Many of the players in line were Tier 3 experts, and some of their auras even made Magic Flash and his companions shudder with fear. There were dozens of those experts too. Even more surprising, every one of those experts obediently stood in line before the Freedom Hotel's front desk. The scene stupefied Magic Flash and his party. Normally, such experts could act as vice commanders, even commanders of their guild's legions. Players of their caliber warranted respect, regardless of where they were, yet they waited in line with a bunch of ordinary players. What was happening here? Moreover, Magic Flash's party was confused by the fact that every one of those experts, including the peak experts, seemed excited and grateful to receive one of the Freedom Hotel's room tokens from the front desk. Suddenly, Gentle Snow approached the cloaked party asking, Are you representatives from Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society? That's right, we are, the middle-aged man confirmed, nodding as he spotted the Zero Wing emblem Gentle Snow wore. He was more than a little surprised when he sensed Gentle Snow's powerful aura. In that case, please follow me. Our guild leader is waiting in the reception room upstairs, Gentle Snow said after verifying the party's identity. She then led the party to the elevator that would take them to the appropriate floor. Many of the experts waiting for their room tokens were jealous as they watched Magic Flash's party follow Gentle Snow. Crap. Who are those people? They actually get to use the elevator that'll take them to the 80th floor and beyond. They must be Zero Wing's allies. If I remember correctly, only the hotel's silver members get to stay on those floors. You need more than just coins and magic crystals to become a silver member too. You also need to earn a large number of membership points. I've heard that not even top adventurer teams' commanders were granted silver memberships. Zero Wing is too stingy. It actually wants us to earn points just to stay in this hotel. I wonder when I'll earn enough to become a silver member. It's not all that unusual. There are only a limited number of rooms available after all, and I've heard that the advanced rooms on the 80th floor and above are amazing. Not only is the recovery speed there 30% higher than in normal rooms, but each room also has its own training room. Players can practice simple combat techniques by themselves in those training rooms. Seriously, you can actually practice your combat skills in the advanced rooms. This won't do. I need to become a silver member as soon as possible. The players waiting in the Freedom Hotel's lobby were indescribably jealous as they watched Magic Flash's party enter the elevator. Their reactions confused the dark players. A short moment later, the group arrived on the Freedom Hotel's top floor. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. The instant Magic Flash and the others set foot on the Freedom Hotel's top floor, their minds felt serene. To be precise, They felt mentally refreshed as if their thoughts had found their own unique paths. They could now conceptualize ideas without confusion. So, this is Zero Wing? Magic Flash and the others couldn't help but gasp when they felt the change. They had already been astonished by the Freedom Hotel's mana, but compared to this environment, the lobby was nothing. If they could train on this floor, they'd see results dozens of times faster. They might even be able to break into the Void Realm. Our guild leader is inside. Please go in, Gentle Snow said, not surprised in the slightest to see the 6 players' astonished expressions. She simply smiled as she opened the reception room's doors. Chapter 2557, Astonishing Foundations. Gentle Snow's request yanked Magic Flash and the others from their reverie, and they walked into the VIP reception room with awkward expressions. As they entered the room, however, they were once again left speechless. The refreshed sensation they had enjoyed in the hall had been amazing, but it was amplified several times the moment they set foot in the reception room. The strange energy in the room was clearly denser than in the hall. If they could train inside this reception room for a few days, their combat standards would reach the next level. Even the various powers would treat a room like this like a sacred training ground, barring entry to anyone other than core members, and yet, Zero Wing used it as a reception room. Extravagance. This was too extravagant. A male swordsman reclined on one of the sofas in the reception room, wearing a simple set of equipment and a black cloak across his back. Opposite of the swordsman was a woman who had barely reached level 100. The woman radiated no aura whatsoever and looked even weaker than ordinary players. However, the advanced Master Forger's insignia the woman wore was extraordinarily eye-catching. The woman was none other than Melancholic Smile, who had been busy managing the candlelight trading firm. After long hours of crafting and frantic research, she had successfully become an advanced Master Forger as well. Guild leader, this is our current limit. The forging techniques involved are simply too delicate and complex. Crafting a successful product in a short time is impossible, I'm afraid. Melancholic Smile disappointedly insisted as she placed several pieces of equipment on the table between her and Shifeng. The moment she did, Magic Flash and the others' eyes widened in shock. Not only were the several equipment pieces part of the same set, but they also carried the glow of fine gold equipment. In other words, the equipment placed on the table was a fine gold set equipment. Moreover, it was a level 100 plus fine gold set equipment. Even Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society had only found a few sets, yet Zero Wing could craft it, and based on Melancholic Smile's comment, that was a failed product. Meanwhile, as Magic Flash's party entered the reception room, Shifeng's gaze shifted to his guests. You must be Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society's representatives. Please have a seat, Shifeng said. When he noticed that Magic Flash's group couldn't pull their eyes from the failed items on the table, he chuckled and said, "It seems you are very interested in this Dark Demon set." After returning to Stone Forest City, he had immediately instructed Gentle Snow to pass the Dark Demon set forging design to Melancholic Smile for research and production. He had enough responsibilities at the moment and didn't have the time to forge the set equipment himself. In contrast, Melancholic Smile could and did devote her free time to forging. Hence, she improved her skills a lot faster than Shifeng could. She had even become an advanced Master Forger before he had. The candlelight trading firm also had Cream Cocoa, who focused all of her time on forging since she didn't have any management duties as Melancholic Smile did. She improved even faster than Melancholic Smile and had become the first advanced Master Forger in Candlelight. Now the trading firm had two. Unfortunately, the Dark Demon set proved far more difficult to produce than Shifeng had expected, and even after working together, Cream Cocoa and Melancholic Smile had barely managed to craft one fine gold set. Moreover, their production success rate wasn't particularly high. Even after involving all sorts of tools and rare materials, they had only managed to raise their success rate to 50%. I apologize for our earlier rude behavior. The bearded middle-aged man from Deity Society hurriedly apologized. It's just that level 100 plus fine gold set equipment is a truly rare sight. I had never imagined that Zero Wing was capable of crafting such equipment. It surprised me, but rest assured, we won't reveal this secret to anyone. It's fine. This doesn't need to be a secret. Since Dark Rhapsody, Deity Society and Zero Wing are allies, you don't need to behave like outsiders. If you are interested, I can sell you a few sets, Shifeng nonchalantly offered. Zero Wing's possession of the Dark Demon's set forging design had already been exposed. Only news of it hadn't reached the eastern continent. Hence there was no need to keep it a secret. Moreover, Shifeng intended to store these fine gold-ranked Dark Demon sets in the guild warehouse, making them available for purchase later. Once he did, there would be no containing the information. Besides, the sooner the public learned about the Dark Demon set, the better. That way, Zero Wing could use the set to attract more experts to join the guild. Are you serious, guild leader Black Flame? Magic Flash could not help but ask. That was a level 100 plus fine gold set equipment they were talking about. If he could get his hands on such a set, his combat power would increase by at least 30%. He might even catch up to peak experts of the same level. Of course, Shifeng said, smiling when he saw the passionate light in Magic Flash's gaze. However, it won't be cheap and I won't sell them for coins. He did not mind selling the fine gold-ranked Dark Demon set. This was only a failed product after all, and at this point most superpowers had at least a few sets of fine gold set equipment. Selling some to Zero Wing's partners wouldn't harm his guild in any way. What do you want for the set then? Magic Flash eagerly asked. Darkness crystals, Shifeng said. My price isn't very high. What do you think of 15,000 crystals? The various powers still thought only dark players needed darkness crystals, but they didn't realize that as God's Domain's lifestyle players continued to develop, attributed magic crystals would become more valuable. Weapons and equipment crafted with attributed magic crystals would gain additional properties related to the crystals. Such changes wouldn't be visible in the item's attribute panel, but in the hands of Tier 3 players and above, they'd perform considerably better, especially for players with fully unlocked mana bodies. Fortunately, darkness crystals were relatively easy to acquire in the dark world. Hence, Shifeng had decided to collect some before the various powers realized their value. 15,000 crystals per set? Magic Flash was shocked. Isn't that a little too much, Guild Leader Black Flame? Level 100 plus fine gold set equipment was indeed very rare and some of the best equipment available in God's Domain right now, but darkness crystals were similarly rare and valuable. In fact, they were worth even more than magic crystals to dark players. Guild Leader Black Flame, is what you say really true? The bearded middle-aged man suddenly interrupted. Why would I lie? I want 15,000 darkness crystals per set. If you wish to buy them, you may do so whenever you wish, Shifeng said. He could not help but feel a little exasperated at the middle-aged man's question. Before Magic Flash could refuse the offer, the middle-aged man from Deity Society continued. Deity Society will buy them. We'll buy as many sets as you're willing to sell us. The older man declared, determined. Have you gone insane, Old Forest? Magic Flash was astonished. What a joke. The Dark Demon set was just a level 100 plus fine gold set equipment. 15,000 darkness crystals would be the maximum anyone would pay for such a set, yet his companion jumped at the chance to buy them. Magic Flash couldn't think of any sane reason why he'd act like this. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. You wait. Something's not right. Magic Flash realized something felt off when he saw the bearded man's nonchalant reaction. He immediately activated his identification skill and turned to the Dark Demon set on the table. Both Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society had sent players with advanced identification skills to lead their respective groups as insurance. While Magic Flash led Dark Rhapsody's team, Deity Society's leader for this party was Old Forest. There had to be a problem for Old Forest to act like this. Don't bother with an appraisal, Old Flash. The fine gold set equipment on the table isn't some level 105 set. It's a top-tier fine gold set equipment that players can use until level 120. No one had ever found anything like it in the dark world. Old Forest whispered as Magic Flash used his own advanced identification skill. Chapter 2558, Wildly Arrogant Zero Wing. Upon hearing Old Forest's words, Magic Flash gasped. Fine gold set equipment that can be used up to level 120? Currently, the best-known fine gold set equipment in the dark world could be used only up to level 105. Even Dark Rhapsody's peak experts sported only level 105 dark gold equipment, which was the equivalent of level 110 fine gold equipment, hardly comparable to level 110 fine gold set equipment. Level 120 fine gold set equipment was simply unimaginable. That's right. Aside from level 100 plus epic equipment, There's no better equipment than this in the entire Dark World, Old Forest said, nodding as he tried to suppress the excitement in his heart. If the price was indeed 15,000 darkness crystals for level 120 fine gold set equipment, then it was definitely acceptable. This was especially true when the Dark World's various powers were frantically raiding level 100 team dungeons. Due to the abysmally low drop rate for level 100 plus weapons and equipment, these powers were not making any significant progress with their dungeon raids. This, in turn, led to a stagnation in their development. If he could secure a batch of Dark Demon sets for Divine Society, then his guild would have a massive advantage over the other guilds. With this advantage, they could easily earn back the cost of the Dark Demon sets. As soon as Old Forest finished speaking, excitement also shone in Magic Flash's eyes. Magic Flash immediately said, "Guild leader Black Flame, Dark Rhapsody will also buy everything you have. Darkness crystals definitely aren't a problem." If he could get his hands on multiple Dark Demon sets, then the plate armor classes of the guild's main force would be in for a wonderful time. They wouldn't have to worry about finding equipment before reaching level 125. Moreover, the main force would also have a much easier time raiding level 100 team dungeons. In fact, Dark Rhapsody might even become the first guild in the Dark World to clear a 100-man level 100 team dungeon. The Dark Demon sets production is much more difficult than you think. I don't have many sets available. Even now, we have managed to produce only 4 sets, Shifeng said, chuckling at the longing expressions of the two people before him. Shifeng wished he could produce as many Dark Demon sets as he wanted. However, the Dark Demon set was actually level 110 to level 120 Dark Gold set equipment. The materials needed to produce it were extremely rare, which severely limited its production volume. Moreover, even when making the failed version of the Dark Demon set, the production success rate was only 50%. Only 4 sets? Magic Flash and Old Forest felt a little disappointed when they heard Shifeng's words. However, after giving the matter some thought, they found it reasonable. After all, this was level 120 fine gold set equipment they were talking about. If it were so easy to produce, Zero Wing would be invincible. Of course, it isn't exactly impossible if your two guilds wish to purchase them in large quantities, Shifeng said, smiling when he saw the disappointment on the two men's faces. Upon hearing Shifeng's words, Old Forest immediately understood what Shifeng was insinuating. Without hesitation he replied, "Guild leader Black Flame, please state your conditions. So long as they are within my authority, I can definitely agree to them on behalf of Deity Society." Just being able to purchase a few Dark Demon sets at 15,000 darkness crystals per set could already be considered a miracle, all the more so for purchasing a large batch of the sets. With a sufficiently large number of the sets, a guild could raise the overall strength of its main force by a large margin. Zero Wing was naturally under no obligation to give away such a wonderful opportunity to their two guilds. "It is the same for my side as well," Magic Flash said. If he missed out on such a windfall, his guild leader and the elders of the guild would beat him to death when he returned. On the other hand, if he succeeded in this negotiation, then he would make a huge contribution to the guild. Although the production of the Dark Demon set is difficult, manufacturing several sets a day is still feasible. Zero Wing is willing to supply these sets to your two guilds long-term, Shifeng said. However, I hope that your two guilds can help Zero Wing's candlelight trading firm establish itself in the Dark World's major NPC cities and guarantee the safety of its operation. Silence momentarily fell over the entire room after Shifeng finished speaking, as both Magic Flash and Old Forest looked at him in astonishment. They never thought that Zero Wing's guild leader had such enormous ambitions. The Dark World was equivalent to roughly 3 ordinary empires on the main continent. The other world's player population was larger than even that of the Fire Dragon Empire, one of the 4 great empires of God's domain. As the Dark World had been sealed all this time, it had almost no contact with the main continent whatsoever. Hence, the Dark World's various powers thoroughly monopolized the other world's NPC cities. Moreover, the NPC cities found in the Dark World were different from those found on the main continent in that players held partial authority over them, which made taking over the Dark World's NPC cities incredibly difficult for outside powers. Meanwhile, the opening of the Dark World's portal now presented both the Dark World's powers and the main continent's powers with a huge business opportunity. Needless to say, the main continent's various superpowers would definitely contest over this opportunity and would naturally be willing to offer unimaginable prices. Guild leader Black Flame, I'm afraid I don't have the authority to decide on such a matter, Old Forest stated honestly. Moreover, this matter involves a lot of interest. Even if Zero Wing is offering up the Dark Demon set, I do not believe my superiors will agree to your condition. As for Magic Flash, he inwardly rolled his eyes at Shifeng's demand. The Dark Demon set might be capable of further elevating the strength of their guild's main forces, but its value was nothing compared to the wealth of 3 empires worth of players. This was also one of the reasons why the various superpowers were avoiding hostilities with dark guilds, as doing so would mean losing a massive business opportunity. At this moment, let alone team leaders like Magic Flash and Old Forest, even the other 4 members of the party disdained Shifeng. Shifeng was actually trying to secure such a huge business opportunity by offering just a few sets of fine gold set equipment. Did he take them for fools? Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Moreover, Zero Wing was already having problems keeping its position in Cold Spring Forest, yet Shifeng actually wanted to enter the Dark World's various NPC cities. This was a complete and utter joke. Don't be in such a rush to reject my offer. I understand that this involves a lot of benefits. I know even the Dark Demon set is insufficient to persuade your 2 guilds, Shifeng said, chuckling at the duo's reactions. However, what if I can make it so that the people of your 2 guilds can freely move between the Dark World and Cold Spring Forest, while everyone else from the Dark World cannot? Guild leader Black Flame, what do you mean? Old Forest asked, unable to grasp Shifeng's meaning. Guild leader Black Flame, you should know that the portal connecting the Dark World and the main continent has already been opened. The Dark World's players can come and go as they wish. This is something even Flaming Light, the holder of the portal's key, cannot stop. What can Zero Wing possibly do? Magic Light said, laughing. I don't know whether Flaming Light can stop those players or not, but from now onward, Zero Wing is taking ownership of the Dark World's portal in Cold Spring Forest. Shifeng said, smiling. He paid no attention to the ridicule Magic Flash and the others were displaying. Chapter 2559, Heading Toward the Dark World? Magic Flash and his companions stared at Shifeng in stunned silence. How arrogant. This swordsman was wildly arrogant. Not even the main continent's super guilds would dare spout such nonsense. They were talking about all of the players in an entire otherworld, and not just any ordinary otherworld but one subjected to cruel competition. Residents of the Dark World had to be extremely careful. Not only could a single mistake cost them their lives, but someone else could also benefit from their hard work. Hence, the Dark World had almost no ordinary players. Most would delete their accounts and try to start over in another world after spending just a few days in the other world. The players that chose to remain were either experts or particularly skilled at survival. When tens of millions of these players swarmed Cold Spring Forest, not even 5 superpowers working together could stop them all, much less a single superpower. Even if the various superpowers on the main continent banded together, they'd pay an unimaginable price to defeat the Dark World's denizens. Their losses might be severe enough to cause their eventual collapse. Shifeng, however, had just declared that Zero Wing could take control of the Dark World's portal. For a moment, Magic Flash and his party wondered if this swordsman had lost his mind. Did the man assume that he owned God's domain? Guild leader Black Flame, I don't mean to doubt you, but this matter does involve too many interests. I do not have the authority to agree to such a deal, Old Forest insisted. After taking in a deep breath, he continued, only my guild leader can preside over this matter. The most I can do is inform him of your offer. I cannot say whether or not he'll agree. That's right. Why don't we return and discuss this with our guild leaders for now? Later we'll return with the results of those discussions, Magic Flash suggested, nodding in agreement. Inwardly, however, he had already decided that Shifeng was a lunatic. While the Dark Demon set might be valuable, obtaining fine gold set equipment wouldn't be an issue once their guilds began to negotiate alliances with the various superpowers. The only downside was that the various superpowers couldn't provide fine gold set equipment that players could use until level 120. However, it would be more than enough to raid team dungeons and grind for levels. Even as a lifestyle player, Melancholic Smile could tell that Magic Flash and Old Forest were making perfunctory promises, let alone Shifeng, whose 5 senses had already reached their limits. I understand. With so many interests involved, reaching a swift decision will be very difficult for your two guilds. Zero Wing isn't in a rush, so I have no problems waiting for you to relay the situation to your guild leaders. Shifeng calmly agreed. Please rest assured, Guild Leader Black Flame. We'll inform our guild leaders upon our return, Old Forest said, nodding. Following which, Magic Frost and Old Forest each handed Shifeng their promised 250,000 darkness crystals before leaving the Freedom Hotel and making their way back to the Dark World. Once they left, Gentle Snow frowned. Guild Leader, now that the Dark World's portal has opened, should we restrict our guild members' range of activity? Gentle Snow asked. She hadn't expected the portal to open so quickly. Fortunately, Zero Wing had reached an agreement with Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society regarding the Darkness Crystal's delivery as soon as it did. Otherwise, Zero Wing wouldn't have known when the portal opened and would have lost its opportunity to prepare for battle. That won't be necessary. Since the Dark World's portal is open, we should visit this other world. Contact Fire's team and the Hell Legion and inform them to gather, Shifeng said, chuckling. Are we really going there? Shifeng's decision surprised her. When Shifeng had declared his intentions to Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society's representatives, she hadn't thought it was nonsense in the least. As long as Zero Wing had enough time, it was entirely possible. Not only did the guild now have the Freedom Hotel, but the guild as a whole also earned a daily net profit of more than 100,000 gold. Moreover, Zero Wing's coin and magic crystal income would continue to increase as Stone Forest City's player population did. With the Freedom Hotel to attract players, more expert players would flood into the city as well. With so many advantages, growing until it ruled Cold Spring Forest with an iron fist was entirely possible. Now, however, including the Hell Legion, Zero Wing only had a little over 500 Tier 3 experts under its command. Even if they included the 600 or so Tier 3 knights, they weren't powerful enough to challenge the Dark World in its entirety. We're heading there now. If we don't hurry, it'll be too late, Shifeng stated, determination lacing his tone. All right. I'll notify Fire and the others, Gentle Snow answered. Although she didn't understand what Shifeng intended, they shouldn't have any problems surviving. Melancholic, how is the construction of the Crimson Dragon flying ships coming along? Shifeng asked, turning to the Candlelight's manager. Excluding the one in your possession, we have a total of 5 Crimson Dragon flying ships ready. Melancholic Smile proudly informed him. Although more players now had flying mounts of their own, 5 flying ships were more than enough for Zero Wing to rule the skies. Not one of God's domain's other powers could threaten the guild in the air. Good. Get them ready, Shifeng said, nodding. While Gentle Snow and Melancholic Smile saw to their preparations, Magic Flash and his team flew back to the Dark World's portal atop their darkness bats. Upon their return to their home Otherworld, they noticed the swarm of dark players and tents filling the gravel plain 1,000 yards ahead. There were easily millions of dark players in the camp. Every one of these dark players practically vibrated with darkness energy and bloodlust, and even the lowest leveled among them was level 105. Quite a few were also Tier 3 experts. We haven't been gone that long, yet so many more have already gathered? Magic Flash exclaimed, watching the massive crowd below. From what he could tell, at least 4 or 5 million players had set up in the camp. In comparison, the several tens of thousands of players Dark Rhapsody had dispatched were nothing. When Magic Flash thought back to Shifeng's arrogant claim, he couldn't help but view the man as even more of a fool. However, Magic Flash and Old Forest continued to carry out their duties and inform their higher-ups of Shifeng's proposal. Within a conference tent containing hundreds of players, Black Flame is insane. Now that the Dark World's portal has opened, he'll have a hard time just protecting himself, yet he has designs on our otherworld? When Blue Rainbow, the female Dark Knight from Dark Rhapsody, heard Magic Flash and Old Forest's report, she could not help but laugh. It's probably because he hasn't seen the gathered army yet. Once he does, like the various superpowers from earlier, he'll likely abandon the naive thought, Deity Society's Elder Gold replied, similarly smiling. A few superpowers who had been informed of the portal's opening had sent representatives to the Dark World not long ago. They had wanted to negotiate business deals with the Otherworld's various powers, but when they saw the number of dark players waiting for the impending invasion, every one the representatives had dropped their proposals. Those superpowers representatives had realized that the moment the gathered dark players burst through the open portal, even the neighboring kingdoms and empires would be at risk, let alone Cold Spring Forest. In truth, even the Dark World's top 3 guilds had been surprised by how many players had joined the invading army. They had only estimated that around 20,000 experts would show up, yet more than 30,000 Tier 3 experts had already joined the camp. At this rate, they wouldn't have any problems gathering 40 or 50,000 Tier 3 experts by the time the invasion began. While Blue Rainbow and Elder Gold spoke in hushed whispers, the various representatives in the tent fell silent. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. It seems everyone is of the same opinion. In that case, there's no point in continuing this discussion. We can still afford to ignore Stone Forest City, but since the Dark World has mustered such a powerful army, we cannot let the main continent's superpowers take our share of the city. A cold, robust man resting in one of the 3 main seats within the tent spoke up. Standing, he continued, "Let us officially advance into Cold Spring Forest. It's time we show the main continent's powers the strength of our Dark World." As the robust man finished speaking, the various representatives ordered their subordinates to march on Cold Spring Forest. The several million players in the plain began to stomp toward the gigantic door before them, shocking the scouts the main continent's superpowers had sent. These scouts immediately contacted their superiors to inform them of the shocking scene. Meanwhile, in an advanced room on the Freedom Hotel's 29th floor. So, in the end, they're still invading? Yuan Tiexian shook his head and sighed when he read his subordinate's message. Chapter 2560, Darkness Invades. Zero Wing arrives shortly after Yuan Tiexian read his subordinate's message. The door to the quiet room opened. A group of players walked in behind a male half-elf covered in azure sparks. As the half-elf entered the room, all of the fire-type mana began to gather around him as if summoned. As a result, the room's temperature steadily rose. "Shine, what are you doing here?" Yuan Tiexian was surprised to see the male half-elf, Scorching Shire. There weren't many people in the secret pavilion that knew the name Scorching Shine, and those who did were generally members of the guild's older generations. While Scorching Shine's current appearance made him look as if he were in his 30s, he was actually over 50. The man had withdrawn from the secret pavilion's front lines many years ago and was only active behind the scenes. Before Scorching Shine had withdrawn, he had been considered one of the pavilion's absolute monsters. He could even contend with the commander of mythology's strongest trump card legion. He no longer busied himself with guild affairs, however, preferring to focus on his own improvement. Not even Yuan Tiexian, who had a close relationship with Scorching Shrine, could begin to imagine how powerful the man had become. However, Scorching Shrine's individual strength wasn't the reason he was so well known in the secret pavilion. Rather, it was the Scorched Legion under his command. The Scorched Legion was one of the secret pavilion's trump card legions, and Scorching Shrine had personally nurtured every one of its experts. Although the legion only had 200 members, they were all geniuses Scorching Shrine had handpicked from the pavilion's new recruits. Initially, the man had set his sights on Purple Jade as well. Unfortunately, she preferred one-handed swords, and Scorching Shrine's knowledge of the combat style was limited. In the end, she hadn't joined his Scorched Legion. The Scorched Legion was still considered a hidden force, secretly fighting on God's domain's front lines. It existed solely for exploring new maps and almost never meddled in guild affairs. Now, however, Scorching Shine and his legion had come to Stone Forest City, which left Yuan Tiexian a little confused. "We received the command from Vice Guild Leader Dawn. Now that the Dark World's portal has opened, she specifically sent me to negotiate with the various superpowers targeting the city," Scorching Shine softly explained. "Vice Guild Leader Dawn sent you to take charge of the situation?" Hearing the news, Yuan Tiexian breathed a sigh of relief. "This is good. With you here, I'm sure those superpowers will show restraint. In that case, Zero Wing might have a chance of fending off their combined assault." Yuan Tiexian had been worried that Dawn Jade had given up on Stone Forest City, but now that the Scorched Legion had arrived, the city had gained an additional layer of defense. The Scorched Legion was no weaker than Netherworld Empire's Hell Legion. In fact, in large-scale combat, the Scorched Legion would easily outperform the Hell Legion since none of its members were human. Aside from half-elves which were particularly skilled with magic, The Legion had half-war members who were formidable melee fighters. Their combat power was leagues greater than human players of the same level and tier. Of course, the secret pavilion had paid a huge price to ensure that the Scorched Legion's members reached Tier 3 as quickly as possible. Don't get excited just yet. Stone Forest City's recent promotion has made the various superpowers even more desperate to obtain it. Even with my Legion here, we can't guarantee that Zero Wing will keep the right to rule Stone Forest City. However, if Zero Wing is willing to hand over some of the city's shares, I'm sure keeping the city under its control won't be a problem, Xianxia calmly stated. Let's not waste any more time. The Dark Worlds players are already marching on Cold Spring Forest. We need to prepare quickly. I'm not familiar with Black Flame, so you'll have to contact him. That won't be a problem. I'll inform Zero Wing right away, Xianxia agreed, nodding. He then contacted his connections in Zero Wing. The various superpowers' combined force wasn't the most worrisome. Rather, the Dark World's forces warranted more concern. Not even the secret pavilion had expected the Dark World to be so powerful. The Otherworld's invading army had more than 5 million experts, and more than 30,000 of them were Tier 3 experts. The army also had more than 50 flying mounts, and to make matters worse, these numbers only grew as time passed. If this army were allowed to flood into Cold Spring Forest, the consequences would be dire. Shortly after Xianxia contacted Zero Wing, however, he froze in shock. Old Yuan, has something happened with Zero Wing? Xianxia asked, his curiosity piqued when he noticed his old comrade's stunned expression. Not long ago, Black Flame led a team to the Dark World's portal. He plans to negotiate with the Dark World's players, Xianxia grimly explained. Negotiate with the Dark World's players? The news dazed Xianxia as well. He then looked at Xianxia and asked, Are you sure Black Flame's brain is working properly? What a joke. With the portal to the Dark World open, the Otherworld's players were like a pack of starving wolves that had just spotted fresh meat. They'd pounce on anyone they encountered, not wait for negotiations. This was precisely the reason that the various superpowers had ordered their members to stay at least 10,000 yards away from the portal, afraid that they'd lose their subordinates to these ravenous wolves. Shifeng, however, was doing the exact opposite. Instead of strengthening Stone Forest City's defenses, he had taken the initiative to contact the Dark World's players personally. He was heading straight for the portal, basically offering himself up, gift-wrapped, to the Dark World's army. Even the various superpowers were stunned when they learned of Shifeng's plan from their spies in Zero Wing. What was going on? Was Zero Wing about to surrender? Inside another advanced room within the Freedom Hotel. Illusory, it seems Zero Wing will fall, even without the various superpowers' interference, the fierce man from Crimson Emperor said as he read a report from his subordinate. Shaking his head, he continued, We won't even have to wait 2 or 3 days for this war to conclude. Everything will likely end today. This is insane. We're talking about an entire otherworld of experts. Why would he pull such a crazy stunt? Illusory Words couldn't believe her eyes when she read the report. When Shifeng had tried to challenge an entire city with only several hundred players, she had seen a possibility for him to succeed, but trying to repel all of the players from an otherworld was a fool's dream. This was no longer a force an individual power could hope to overcome. While Illusory Words and many others were puzzled by Shifeng's most recent ploy, Furious Heart, who had been busy persuading the Dark World's players to act, received the news. Interesting. Seems Black Flame really loves a fight. He must think this battle will be just like the one in Demon City. Furious Heart laughed as he read the report. Hopefully he doesn't turn and flee after witnessing the Dark World's army. I wouldn't want this to be too boring. Elated, Furious Heart shifted his gaze to the invading army that marched through the portal into Cold Spring Forest. In the face of this army of several million dark players, even a kingdom would fall, much less Zero Wing. Following which, Furious Heart tossed aside the report and led his team through the portal. When the Dark World's players arrived in Cold Spring Forest, a commotion broke out among the army. So, this is the main continent? Crap. There are so many rare ores and herbs nearby. This place is ours for the taking. The dark players couldn't help their growing excitement as they drank in the beautiful scenery in Cold Spring Forest. They wanted nothing more than to claim the surrounding resource areas right away. Even the upper echelons from the otherworld's various powers looked around them with a passionate flame burning in their eyes. They had to admit that Cold Spring Forest was a much higher quality than the Dark World's level 100 maps. As long as they could collect these resources, neither their individual development nor their guilds would be a problem. Before the Dark World's residents could celebrate, however, they heard a loud roaring from the distance, a deep rumble that echoed throughout the valley the portal occupied. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Everyone turned toward the origin of the sound. The dark players then spotted 5 colossal figures flying toward them. As the roaring grew louder, they could begin to distinguish the flying giants' details. Are those flying ships? With a closer look and realizing what the monstrosities were, everyone was stunned. Those 5 flying ships were too massive. The largest flying mounts they had seen would be insignificant beside the steel giants. As the 5 flew in formation, they practically blotted out the sky. Chapter 2561 E0 Wings Foundations, Madness Time. Why are so many flying ships here? Did we trigger some kind of event and NPCs have come to deal with us? The sudden appearance of the 5 flying ships stunned the dark players emerging from the gigantic door. They all began to talk about the incoming ships, anxious. Flying ships were no longer a foreign concept to God's Domains players, but their familiarity was precisely the reason that the dark players were afraid of how powerful the machines were. Flying ships were powerful war weapons and absolute kings in the skies. One of those ships could effortlessly squash humans like ants. Current players who sorely lacked aerial combat power saw flying ships as unstoppable and destructive tools. With 5 flying ships approaching, why wouldn't these dark players worry? Wait, something's not right. There are players aboard the flying ships. A Tier 3 ranger, gifted with sharp vision, shouted as he pointed to the Crimson Dragon flying ships hovering above them. Nearly everyone's eyes narrowed as they tried to get a better look at the ships, and just as the Tier 3 ranger had announced, players stood on each of the flying ships' decks. While they were still too far off to get a clear view of the players, the green diamond markers were undoubtedly above the blurry figures' heads. Who are those people? They actually have flying ships. Could it be a super guild? Their curiosity piqued. The dark players wondered who piloted the incoming vessels. Flying ships were still far out of reach for the Dark World's residents. They barely had any flying mounts after all, and yet 5 player-owned flying ships were flying toward them right now. Even the upper echelons from the other world's various major powers were stunned. 5 flying ships. Who are these people? What are they trying to accomplish? 1 or 2 flying ships might not be a major problem, but 5 was a little too much. None of them wanted to face such a force in battle. If it did come down to a fight, the outcome wouldn't be in their favor, even if they eventually won. While the Dark World's powers discussed the situation in hushed tones, the 5 ships descended, stopping roughly 100 yards above ground. A figure then jumped from one of the ship's decks, landing in the center of the dark players' army. The players on the ground unconsciously stepped back, quickly clearing the way for the figure to land unhindered. As the figure landed, the various powers' upper echelons stared with wide, shocked eyes, particularly Magic Flash and Old Forest, who had just returned from their trip to Stone Forest City. The individual who had jumped from one of the flying ships was none other than Zero Wings guild leader, Black Flame. It's him. Impossible. When Magic Flash and Old Forest saw Shurfeng's familiar face, they couldn't believe their eyes. Any power capable of owning 5 flying ships had to be a superpower with heaven-defying strength in their opinions, and yet the reality was that Zero Wing, a guild at risk of obliteration, was responsible for this display. How could they possibly believe this? Sure enough, it is Zero Wing, Blue Rainbow thought, standing behind Magic Flash. Unlike the 2 representatives, she didn't seem all that surprised to see Shurfeng. Is this why he is so confident? The Dark World's general populace considered flying ships to be out of players' reach, but when Dark Rhapsody had investigated Zero Wing's background, it had discovered that the guild owned multiple ships. This was why Shurfeng had failed to surprise her. Of course, she wasn't entirely unfazed. She was a little shocked to discover that Zero Wing had as many as 5 fling ships. It was a few more than her guild's reports had stated. When Furious Heart saw this, his lips formed a tight frown. Intense rage and fear flashed in his eyes as he watched Shurfeng. How is this possible? How does Zero Wing have so many flying ships? Furious Heart's eyes were bloodshot as he stared at the steel giants in the air. His guild had already been concerned when they received the report mentioning 3 flying ships in Zero Wing's possession. Now that he knew the guild had 2 more than that, Stone Forest City would be much more difficult to deal with. As the Dark World's major powers recognized Shi Feng and were astonished over his guild's foundations, an indifferent, robust man emerged from the crowd. The instant he stepped forward, he attracted all of the major powers' attention, and everyone watched him with respectful gazes. This robust man was Dawn Dominance, World Domination's guild leader. He was a legend in the Dark World. Not only had he single-handedly developed world domination to become one of the Otherworld's top 3 guilds, but he was also one of the Dark World's top-ranked experts. Dawn Dominance was precisely why Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society were so afraid of the up-and-coming world domination. He had even been chosen to preside over the earlier war conference. "You must be Zero Wing's guild leader, Black Flame," Dawn Dominance addressed Shi Feng. "I am Dawn Dominance, World Domination's guild leader. You could say that I'm one of the leaders for the Dark World's invasion into Cold Spring Forest. May I know the reason for your sudden visit, Guild Leader Black Flame?" "You're correct. I am Black Flame and I've come to inform your Dark World players of something," Shi Feng said, nodding. "If you wish to persuade us to abandon our conquest of this map, forget about it. The matter was decided the moment the portal opened," Dawn Dominance said. "Cold Spring Forest's resources are important to both of us, of which you are well aware, Guild Leader Black Flame. Of course, we also do not wish to antagonize Zero Wing intentionally, but we can only rely on our own strength to get what we need. I hope you understand, Guild Leader Black Flame." As Dawn Dominance finished speaking, the countless Dark players in earshot nodded in agreement. Why should only the main continent's players benefit from Cold Spring Forest's resources? If one wished to acquire leveling resources, they could do so with their own power. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Does Black Flame really think he can scare away so many Dark players with just 5 flying ships? How naive. Furious Heart laughed softly as he watched Shi Feng's distant figure. 5 flying ships was an amazingly powerful force, but if Shi Feng thought he could stop several million experts from the Dark World with just this, he was a fool. Moreover, the Dark World's invasion army had over 50 flying mounts. Challenging those flying ships was entirely possible. Besides, the various powers present all had their own trump cards which they could unleash on the steel giants. As Furious Heart's laughter died, however, Shi Feng glanced around at the chuckling Dark players and shook his head. "Guild Leader Dawn, I believe you've misunderstood something. I never had any intention of negotiation with any of you. I am only here to tell you one thing," Shi Feng said. "From this moment on, this teleportation gate is under Zero Wing's control." Chapter 2562, Challenging the Dark World? Silence fell as Shi Feng finished his declaration. Magic Flash and Old Forest stared at the swordsman with their mouths ajar. They hadn't actually thought he'd been serious. This was insane. They had assumed Shi Feng had been joking back in the Freedom Hotel, and yet, the man had just repeated his intentions straight to the Dark World's various powers and independent players. After a moment, every Dark player broke out in riotous laughter. Did this guy come all this way just to tell us a joke? He actually thinks Zero Wing will manage this teleportation gate from now on? Does he really think he can claim ownership by declaring it? Who does this guy think he is? For a time, the countless Dark players expressed their anger and ridicule. Their prior fear and awe had evaporated like fog on a hot day. They wondered how hard Shi Feng had hit his head to provoke the Dark World in its entirety so boldly. What is Black Flame trying to do? Did he give himself a concussion and lose his mind? Doesn't he realize that he basically just declared war on everyone in the Dark World? Blue Rainbow frowned at Shi Feng, who still seemed quite calm. When they had heard Magic Flash and Old Forest's report, they had considered Shi Feng's intentions a joke. Now, however, Shi Feng had publicly announced Zero Wing's plan to take control of the teleportation gate. If this was a joke, it wasn't funny. As far as she was concerned, this swordsman either overestimated himself or was on a path of self-destruction. Not even multiple cooperating super guilds would dare spout such nonsense before the Dark World's army, much less a single superpower. Anyone that took control of the teleportation gate would reign over the Dark World. This was beyond foolish. He's dead. He's definitely dead now. Furious Heart laughed maniacally as he watched Shi Feng. Thanks to Shi Feng's announcement, the Dark World's various powers and independent experts would stop at nothing to obliterate Zero Wing, even if Demon's Heart didn't pull any strings. They likely wouldn't let the matter rest until they had removed any trace of Zero Wing from Cold Spring Forest. If they didn't, the main continent's players would look down on them, which was something the Dark World's denizens and powers wouldn't allow. Once the Dark World's collective laughter died down, each of these dark players turned lethal gazes on Shifeng, killing intent radiating from them in waves. Some Tier 3 experts even unsheathed their weapons, preparing to teach this arrogant swordsman a lesson. What a pity, Guild Leader Black Flame. I had hoped you were smart enough to know when to advance and when to retreat, but it would seem that Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society had thought too highly of you, Dawn Dominant said, shaking his head. He then turned to leave with no intention of continuing his conversation with Shifeng. A unit of 5 flying ships might be impressive, but it wasn't intimidating enough to force the Dark World's invading army to back down. While war weapons had frightening power and deadly potential, their attack rates were very low. When there wasn't much of a difference between two sides' combat power, an additional 5 flying ships would prove miraculously effective. But if one side had an overwhelming combat power advantage, the ships couldn't turn the tide of battle. At Tier 3, expert players were more than agile enough to evade flying ships' attacks as long as there was enough distance between them. Furthermore, the invading army had more than 50 flying mounts, just as much aerial combat power as Zero Wing. When Dawn Dominance left, the surrounding Tier 3 experts smirked and moved to surround Shifeng. Nearly 1,000 Tier 3 experts pointed their weapons at the swordsman, their combined killing intent so powerful that the air around them grew cold and cloudy. The Tier 2 dark players that had come to Cold Spring Forest to join the fun couldn't contain their excitement as they watched. Not even superpowers had so many Tier 3 experts, yet the Dark World's army had so many more. When less than 50 yards separated these dark experts and Shifeng, figures began to drop from the hovering flying ships, one after another. In the blink of an eye, nearly 500 Tier 3 experts took their places around Shifeng, and every one of them radiated a more intense aura than the Dark World's Tier 3 experts. Seeing reinforcements arrive, the encroaching dark players came to a halt. The various major powers spectating upper echelons were similarly astonished. They had never dreamed that Zero Wing could muster such strength. Now that 500 Tier 3 experts had joined the fray, the Dark World's top 3 guilds would be no match for Zero Wing's force, even if they worked together. Including the flying ships still looming above them, engaging in battle now would only invite Zero Wing to slaughter those top 3 guilds. It's no wonder why you dared to spout such nonsense. Zero Wing is actually quite formidable. Dawn Dominance had stopped, turning to glance at the Tier 3 experts around Shifeng, but he shook his head and continued, "However, I'm afraid that still won't be enough to defeat the Dark World." As he finished speaking, more Tier 3 dark players swarmed around Shifeng. In less than 30 seconds, a group of over 6,000 Tier 3 dark players had joined the encirclement. Even Blue Frost and his Zero Wing companions from Shelter 1, all of whom had participated in numerous battles, couldn't help but frown. "Blue, what do you think the guild leader is trying to do? We're not really going to fight against all those people, are we?" Best Reincarnation, the leader of Shelter 1's second party, nervously asked. He had watched and fought in multiple wars involving tens of thousands of players, but compared to the Dark World's army, those forces weren't worth mentioning. Not even an army of tens of thousands would be a warm-up for these 6,000-plus Tier 3 experts. If this force entered the Dark Den, they could sweep through the Otherworld without any trouble. Even if every shelter banded together, they wouldn't survive. Meanwhile, Zero Wing had fewer than 500 Tier 3 experts present, and even with monsters like Fire Dance and Hell Rush, their chances of victory were unknown. "I don't know, but even if we lose this battle, it'll be helpful in the future. Not just anyone gets an opportunity to face such a powerful force," Blue Frost replied with a bitter smile. He had to admit that while Shifeng's behavior was insane, his blood boiled with excitement. After all, who at this stage of the game would dare challenge such a formidable army? Even the main continent's various superpowers were afraid of the Dark World's invading army, but not Zero Wing. If they lost, they'd lose with their pride intact. This was also a super rare opportunity to clash with a large number of Tier 3 experts, and the experience would definitely bolster their future development. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. As soon as Blue Frost finished his reply, however, Shifeng stepped forward from Zero Wing's defensive circle and faced the Dark World's several thousand Tier 3 experts directly. It seems you still don't understand, Shifeng said, shaking his head at the Tier 3 dark players around him. Calmly he continued, since the very beginning, I told you that I've only come to inform you. I'm not here to negotiate. Since you wish to test my patience, I regret to inform you that you've picked a fight with the wrong person. Shifeng then pulled a token from his bag and started to chant an incantation. It was simple, only consisting of a dozen or so syllables, and would even be easy for a player new to God's domain to chant. Before the dark players could mock Shifeng for his ignorant foolishness, several magic arrays quickly manifested behind the swordsman. In less than a second they transformed into a spatial gate, and once the gate was complete, NPCs in exquisite uniform equipment marched into Cold Spring Forest like a well-trained army. Every one of these NPCs had at least reached level 120 in Tier 3. Many of them even hailed from other races, and in the blink of an eye, more than 1,000 NPCs had joined the battlefield. Chapter 2563. Suppressing everyone. Crazy Zero Wing. When more than 1,000 Tier 3 NPCs appeared behind Shifeng, the Dark players, Zero Wing's members and the Hell Legion were stunned. In the various NPC kingdoms and empires, Tier 3 NPCs were considered powerhouses. They could even serve as magistrates in minor cities. And yet Shifeng had just summoned over 1,000 of these NPCs, including non-human NPCs. It was unbelievable. We already have so many? When Gentle Snow saw Shifeng's night division, surprise colored her features. She had known for a while that Shifeng had invested a ton of coins in developing the guild's night division, but she had assumed they'd need a long time to amass and nurture so many Tier 3 NPCs. During Shifeng's visit to the Western continent, she had felt they'd be lucky enough to gain an additional 200 or 300 Tier 3 knights, but contrary to her expectations they had several times that. With this many Tier 3 knights, not even taking out an army of more than 10,000 Tier 3 players would be a problem, much less defeating the 6,000 Tier 3 dark players before them. The reason was very simple. Not only were NPCs' basic attributes far higher than players of the same level and tier, but they also commanded a large number of skills and spells. Their skill and spell completion rates also triumphed over players. Moreover, as God's domain underwent more system updates, NPCs' intellect and combat standards would improve. At Tier 3, NPCs could already more or less rival Refinement Realm experts, with some surpassing them. This was why even Tier 3 players would receive a one-sided beating if they challenged Tier 3 NPCs. Of course, the biggest difference between the two was NPCs' equipment standards. Acquiring level 100 plus fine gold weapons and equipment was currently incredibly difficult for players, but even the weakest of God's Domain's Tier 3 NPCs, at least those not bound to players, wore full sets of dark gold equipment. Most of Zero Wing's Tier 3 knights, on the other hand, wore epic equipment. Even Tier 3 Void Realm experts would have to flee from these knights, let alone Tier 3 Refinement Realm experts. The surrounding 6,000 plus Tier 3 dark players unconsciously began to retreat. The major powers' upper echelons watched on with grim expressions, astonished. None of them had ever thought Zero Wing's strength would be this frightening. When they had learned throughout their investigations that Zero Wing had nearly 600 Tier 3 knights, the prospect of dealing with the guild had given them huge headaches. If they wanted to capture Stone Forest City, they knew they'd have to work with the main continent's various superpowers. But not only had they just learned that Zero Wing had 5 Crimson Dragon flying ships, but it also had more than twice the reported Tier 3 knights. Just how were they supposed to fight such a force? Is this why he hadn't hesitated to give away 70% of Cold Spring Forest's resource spots? Realization dawned on Blue Rainbow as she watched Shifeng. She had thought the man was insane for giving up so much of Cold Spring Forest and increasing the competition between his guild and the Dark World's various powers, but looking at it now, it seemed she had been sorely mistaken. With so much combat power, no power or player in the Dark World would dare compete with Zero Wing for the remaining 30% of Cold Spring Forest. On the contrary, Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society would have a much harder time controlling their 70%. Most of the two guilds' influence lay in the Dark World, and outside of it they had barely any at all. If the Dark World's players were too afraid to take a bite out of Zero Wing's resource spots, It would only be natural that they'd contest with Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society's territory instead. Damn it! How is this possible? Furious Heart felt as if he were going mad as he gazed at the 1,000+ Tier 3 NPCs behind Shifeng. He couldn't fathom how Zero Wing had gotten its hand on so many, and everyone wore excellent equipment too. Against such a force, not even an army of more than 10,000 Tier 3 experts would have an advantage. Moreover, the Tier 3 experts that had joined the invading army belonged to the various guilds and adventurer teams. Commanding them like a proper army would prove very difficult. No one wanted to serve as cannon fodder and die a pointless death. If the invading army had had an absolute advantage, overwhelming Zero Wing's experts with their numbers would have been easy, but now that there was such a radical difference between the two sides' strength, the various guilds and adventurer teams' Tier 3 experts wouldn't be so keen to take action. The 1,000+ NPCs waiting for orders petrified the Dark Worlds players. They simply stared at Shifeng and his NPCs in silence, stupefying Blue Frost's group. Even the Hell Legion's members were astonished. Before coming here they had accepted their impending deaths. They had been massively outnumbered after all. Even if they were more powerful individually, they wouldn't be able to kill enough players with their limited stamina and concentration. However, none of them had imagined that the situation would develop as it had. The army of several million which had boldly marched into Cold Spring Forest had come to a grinding halt, and none of the Dark Worlds players dared to step forward. Everyone stood frozen in front of the teleportation gate. After the silence had dragged on for a while, Dawn Dominance emerged from the crowd, presenting himself before Shifeng once more. This time, however, the man didn't look down on Shifeng. Rather, he appeared cautious. Guild leader Blackflame, you truly are amazing. It's no wonder how you established Stone Forest City in Cold Spring Forest, Dawn Dominance said, applauding Shifeng in admiration. Since everyone here has recognized your display of strength, on behalf of the Dark World's various guilds and adventurer teams, I will declare that we will not participate in Zero Wing's struggle against the various superpowers. Do you find this arrangement agreeable, Guild leader Blackflame? While Dawn Dominance spoke, the various guilds and adventurer teams' upper echelons nodded in agreement. If Zero Wing had proven as weak as they had expected, they wouldn't have had a problem, but now that they saw how mighty the guild was, they wouldn't fight it. Even if they worked with the main continent's various superpowers, capturing Stone Forest City was impossible. They'd only incur unnecessary losses if they faced Zero Wing in battle. Dawn Dominance. How can you do this? Furious Heart bellowed, enraged, when he heard Dawn Dominance surrender to Zero Wing. To goad the Dark World's various powers into attacking Zero Wing, Demon's Heart had offered world domination a plethora of benefits. However, now that the situation had turned south, Dawn Dominance had decided to give up. With world domination leading the Dark World's surrender, the other world's other powers wouldn't target Zero Wing either. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. EU. Before Furious Heart could continue to curse at Dawn Dominance, however, Shifeng shook his head. Guild leader Dawn, how many times must I repeat myself before you get it through your head? I am only here to notify you that Zero Wing will be managing the Dark World's teleportation gate from now on, and in the future my guild will collect a fee from anyone that wishes to use it. Have I been specific enough now? Shifeng asked the other guild leader. I don't care if you wish to work with those superpowers against Stone Forest City or not. Dawn Dominance, who had intended to say more, was speechless. Even Furious Heart, who had been angrily cursing in the distance, gaped at Shifeng. Is this guy insane? Dawn Dominance has already declared that none of us would target Stone Forest City, yet he insists on managing the teleportation gate. Does he really want to make the entire Dark World his enemy? When Magic Flash heard Shifeng's response, he too was at a loss for words. This was the best outcome Zero Wing could hope for, but rather than settling, Shifeng insisted on owning the Dark World's teleportation gate. He was a madman. Chapter 2564, Crazy? Night Division take action. Does he really plan to start a war with the entire Dark World? Even Furious Heart, who wanted nothing more than Zero Wing and Shifeng's annihilation, was confused by the swordsman's actions. He even wondered if he had misheard the man. Instead of settling for a peaceful outcome, Shifeng continued to insist that he'd wrestle for control over the Dark World's teleportation gate. Even if they banded together, the various superpowers wouldn't dare threaten such a thing. In fact, they hadn't even harbored the thought. The teleportation gate was basically the otherworld player's lifeline, and if a foreign power took control of the gate, all of the Dark World's residents would be subjected to that power's whims. These dark players simply wouldn't allow such an outcome. They'd fight anyone who threatened to control the teleportation gate to the death. This was why neither Demon's Heart nor the various superpowers had considered doing so. If they tried, not only would they fail, but they'd also throw their lives away in the attempt to control the teleportation gate. And yet, Shifeng didn't just consider it an option. He fully intended to succeed. As Shifeng finished speaking, the dark players around him erupted in an uproar. Is Black Flame insane? He's trying to take control of our world's lifeline. We're already giving up so much by surrendering in the fight for Stone Forest City, yet Black Flame wants a mile after we've given him an inch. Does he really doubt that we'll attack Zero Wing? The fear the Dark World's various major powers and independent players had felt a moment ago vanished. Now only fury flashed in their eyes. They all wanted nothing more than to show Shifeng the consequences for his ignorance. The Dark World players began to close in on Zero Wing's guild leader. Their Tier 3 experts who had decided to avoid a fight moments ago, were now more than eager to teach the swordsman a lesson. 7,000, 9,000, 10,000. In less than a minute, more than 20,000 Tier 3 experts had surrounded Shifeng. Every one of them glared, radiating rage and killing intent. The guild leader's not serious, right? Evening Lotus worriedly asked from beside Blue Frost as she watched more Tier 3 experts gather around them. With the combined strength of Zero Wing's Tier 3 knights, Tier 3 experts, and the Crimson Dragon flying ship, they could at most take on 10,000 Tier 3 experts at a time. Any more and their risk of dying increased substantially. If they had to face all of the Dark World's Tier 3 experts, they'd be finished. Here they didn't have the protection of Stone Forest City. Moreover, NPCs were far more troublesome to resurrect than players. Generally, the various powers only used their NPCSW as a deterrent and avoided sending them into battle unless absolutely necessary. Are you serious, Guild Leader Black Flame? Dawn Dominance asked after taking a deep breath, a cold glint flashing in his eyes. While he could ignore the struggle for Stone Forest City, he couldn't ignore Shifeng's declaration to control the teleportation gate as it involved his guild's continued development. Of course. Shifeng confidently replied. He hadn't actually considered taking control of the Dark World's teleportation gate before today, but times had changed. He had developed his night division far faster than expected, and it was now far stronger than it appeared. Shifeng wouldn't have been able to do anything about the situation if the teleportation gate had opened anywhere else. Since it had opened in Cold Spring Forest, where his night division was based, however, he'd be a fool not to take advantage of it. Due to the Dark World's nature, regular powers and players had an incredibly difficult time establishing themselves in the otherworld. Not even the various super guilds were guaranteed success. Yet as luck would have it, the Dark World offered an extraordinary amount of attributed resources, and because of this, the various superpowers of his past had done everything in their power to ally with the Dark World's various powers. However, even after paying astronomical sums, those superpowers had only acquired a small number of attributed resources to use in crafting weapons and equipment. If he were to let this opportunity slip through his fingers, he wouldn't likely find another. Good. It seems you've steeled yourself to make the Dark World your enemy, Guild Leader Black Flame. Dawn Dominance said and smiled. Since that is the case, show us what profound move you'll use to stop us. Dawn Dominance's head had begun to ache over surrendering his share of Stone Forest City's benefits. A few thousand Tier 3 experts were certainly no match for Zero Wing's current combat power. He'd need the Dark World's entire strength. Normally, however, persuading his homeworld's major powers and independent powers to dedicate themselves to what was essentially a suicide mission would be impossible. Fortunately, Shifeng had just given him the opening to succeed with an extremely persuasive bargaining chip. The Dark World's very future. This would be more than enough of a reason for the Dark World's masses to combine their strength. Even if Shifeng's group fell back to Stone Forest City, they wouldn't be able to stop the Otherworld's forces. Why are you still wasting time with him, Guild Leader Dawn? That's right. He only has a little over 1,000 Tier 3 NPCs. Even if we die and lose a level, we can recover quickly and rejoin the fight. On the other hand, those NPCs will be gone for good once they're dead. Let's see if Black Flame keeps acting so arrogantly once we've gotten rid of his NPCs. The various powers experts and independent players riled themselves up and charged at Shifeng's group the moment Dawn Dominance finished speaking. Over 20,000 Tier 3 experts and several 100,000 Tier 2 players advanced, their footfalls shaking the entire valley. Despite their bountiful combat experience, the Hell Legion's members grew nervous, watching the incoming force with grim expressions. This battle would be more terrifying than any they had participated in. The Dark World's various powers didn't even prepare any of their trump cards. Relying solely on their numbers, the invading army could intimidate even God's domain's various superpowers. Moreover, some of the Dark players used Tier 3 defensive magic scrolls to cope with potential Tier 4 attacks. This greatly limited how effective the flying ships could be in this fight. Haha. Die. So what if you have over 1,000 Tier 3 NPCs and 5 flying ships? None of them can reach their full potential in such a vast plain. Furious Heart excitedly shouted as he watched the Dark players swarm toward Shifeng. Every Dark player participating in the army was an expert. They had long since familiarized themselves with large-scale combat and knew how to minimize the damage enemy AoE attacks could deal. Furthermore, unlike in a siege, Zero Wings forces didn't have a defensive magic array to hide behind. Once the two armies engaged, war weapons like the Crimson Dragon flying ships and large-scale destruction spells would be nearly useless. However, Shifeng didn't mobilize his flying ships or instruct his Tier 3 magical class NPCs to cast large-scale destruction spells as everyone had expected. He simply watched the Dark players approach in silence. Have they forgotten how to attack, scared silly? They must not have expected an actual fight, but it's too late for regret now. The Dark players were confused when Zero Wings forces remained motionless, but that didn't stop them in closing the distance. 100 yards, 50 yards, 30 yards. Fools. When less than 30 yards separated Shifeng's forces from the Dark players, he swung a hand forward and shouted, "Attack!" Suddenly, over 100 tall, brawny oars geared with epic weapons and equipment exploded forth, reaching the enemy's front line in the blink of an eye. They brandished their swords and axes, cutting down the enemy Tier 3 MTs with speed and accuracy. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. EU skillfully responding to the Oar Knight's assault, the Tier 3 MTs raised their shields, effectively blocking the attacks. After a moment, however, every Dark player was stupefied. The instant the Oar's weapons slammed into the Tier 3 MT's shields, every player that took a hit flew backward as if a giant boulder had slammed into them. From afar, it had looked like the Dark World's army had crashed into an immovable wall. Not only had the army's advance ended in a grinding halt, but bodies flew above the rest of the force as well. Before these players fell to the ground, however, countless magic arrays appeared above, bombarding them with another series of attacks. The casters exhibited astounding control with their spells, and the spells themselves were unbelievably powerful. Every attack had as much power as level 110 mythic monsters. Despite their defensive spells' protection, the targeted players lost every last HP in no time at all. Over 1,000 Tier 3 players and several Tier 3 players had died in less than a second, leaving nothing but empty space among the tide of Dark players. The Dark World's denizens hadn't even had a chance to retaliate. Chapter 2565, Frightening Night Division, True Despair? Less than 10 seconds after the battle had begun, the Dark players' confidence shattered. The MTs on the front line were bona fide Tier 3 players, and many of them were well-known experts in the Dark World. They had so much HP and defense that they could stand there unfazed as other Tier 3 experts wailed on them. And yet, these same Tier 3 MTs were dying too quickly for the rear line's healers to restore their HPs. They had lost their lives without any chance to retaliate. For a moment, everyone watching wondered if those MTs had deliberately worn bronze equipment into battle. Their opponents were only level 120+, Tier 3 NPCs, and many of the Dark World's players had fought NPC cities Tier 3 soldiers before. Although Tier 3 NPCs might have higher basic attributes and combat standards, the difference shouldn't be this massive. Even Zero Wings players were stunned. The Tier 3 Knights had slain over 1,000 Tier 3 players and several thousand Tier 2 players with a single round of attacks. Such a force would even give super guilds a painful headache, and putting an end to the battle would take quite a while. However, those Tier 2 and 3 Dark players were little more than infants before the Tier 3 Knights. The two sides' combat power was on entirely different levels. Only Shifeng remained unperturbed. His Tier 3 Knights only seemed to be 10 or so levels higher than the enemy's Tier 3 players on the surface. Logically, there shouldn't be such a huge gap between the two forces' strength, even if the Tier 3 Knights were fully armed with epic weapons and equipment. However, God's Domain's current players didn't know that there were significant differences among NPCs' combat power, even at Tier 3. One of the most obvious was the liberation of their mana bodies. Unlike players, NPCs did not need to invest a large amount of time to unlock their mana body's potential after reaching Tier 3. Instead, they relied on their talent and growth potential. As long as Tier 3 NPCs had the required talent and growth potential, they could unlock their mana bodies immediately. Conversely, some failed to accomplish the feat throughout their lifetimes. The applicants Shifeng had accepted into his Knight division were considered elites among NPCs. Their innate talent and growth potential were far superior to the soldiers in NPC cities. Hence, as soon as they reached Tier 3, they had unlocked their mana body's full potential. They hadn't needed to experiment as players did. But what about God's Domain's current players? Most hadn't even started the process of unlocking their mana bodies, let alone unlocked them fully. They were 10 years too early if they thought they could stand against Shifeng's Knight division. Moreover, Shifeng had employed plenty of ores, elves and giants. Their combat power was even greater than human NPCs of the same tier and level. For example, a mysterious iron-ranked or warrior could rival a secret silver-ranked human warrior. Of the non-human members of Shifeng's Knight division, even the weakest had mysterious iron growth potential. Not even Tier 3 peak experts in full top-tier equipment would last more than a few seconds against these NPCs, much less ordinary Tier 3 experts. Before the Dark Worlds players could snap out of their daze, Zero Wing's Knights swept through them again. Like harvesting wheat, the Knights needed no more than 3 moves to slay the Dark players, reaping their lives in the blink of an eye. None had time for elegant or astonishing combat techniques on this battlefield. Only pure strength and terror reigned. The first unit, consisting of more than 50,000 players, had been annihilated in less than 2 minutes, and over 6,000 of them had been Tier 3 experts. In contrast, Zero Wing hadn't lost a single knight. In fact, they had hardly taken any damage. Silence descended on the battlefield. The Dark players that had eagerly charged into combat had begun to back away, one step after another. How is this possible? Furious Heart, who had been preparing to join the fray, gasped when he saw the field of corpses. He had assumed the Dark World's overwhelming victory had been assured. He had never expected the battle to end like this. They were talking about more than 6,000 Tier 3 experts. The horrific force could easily destroy a guild city. Yet before Zero Wing's Knight division, those experts had been as weak as common monsters. How do they have so much more combat power? Blue Rainbow and Elder Gold, who watched from afar, were just as shocked after watching the Knights obliterate the first wave of players. They had thought Shifeng's confidence had been a joke. They had never dreamed that his guild was actually this strong. When Zero Wing had refrained from using its flying ships, they had seen the decision as foolish. Looking at it now, however, that was not the case. Zero Wing had merely decided against using the ships because it didn't need them. How could these 1,000+ NPCs even be Tier 3 beings? They seemed more like Tier 4 mythic monsters and ones with incredibly high combat standards. If the Dark World wanted to defeat such a frightening force, it would have to rely on its foundations. Otherwise, it didn't matter how many players they sent at those Tier 3 NPCs. All would perish. How are these Tier 3 NPCs so strong? Dawn Dominance frowned after watching several thousand Tier 3 experts die. Gritting his teeth, he snarled, "Everyone, now is not the time to hold back. All guilds and adventurer teams, use your trump cards and crush those NPCs. If we keep holding back, Zero Wing will take the teleportation gate." The various guilds and adventurer teams' upper echelons immediately took action. Zero Wing's Knight division might be scary, but their members were no pushovers. Like Zero Wing, they had trump cards that could boost their combat power far above what they currently wielded. One after another, the guilds and adventurer teams activated their trump cards. Tier 4 Summoning Scrolls. Advanced Magic Barriers. Tier 3 Personal Guards. In less than a minute, More than 50 Tier 4 summoned creatures and 4,000 Tier 3 personal guards appeared on the battlefield, their combined aura making everyone in the vicinity shudder. The various superpowers members watching the battle from a safe distance were especially flabbergasted. The Dark Worlds guilds and adventurer teams had just revealed their strength in its fullest. Amazing. Truly amazing. No individual power can hope to stand against the Dark World. Furious Heart's heart pounded as he watched. He had been shocked to see Zero Wing field over 1,000 Tier 3 NPCs, but that was nothing before the Dark World's full power. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Excellent. Everyone. Dawn Dominance proudly ordered. Annihilate Zero Wing and avenge our fallen brothers. As soon as they heard the command, the various guilds and adventurer teams sent their Tier 3 NPCs and Tier 4 summoned creatures into battle. Not even they had thought their combined strength would be so terrifying. Zero Wing's players began to panic a little. Now the tides had turned. But just as the Dark World's residents expected to see Shifeng fall into despair, the person in question gazed upon the approaching NPC force and summoned creatures with an extraordinary calm before retrieving a small ring from his bag. Miniature World. Chapter 2566. Mouths ajar. Seeing Shifeng step forward and chant an incantation, Blue Rainbow and Elder Gold were stunned. He still wants to fight? Confusion changed Blue Rainbow's expression when Shifeng showed no intention of retreating. The difference between their combat power was clear for all to see. The Dark World's invading army was far too strong for any individual power to stop. Based on Shifeng's behavior, however, he intended to stay in this fight. Blue Rainbow struggled to understand. During its investigations, Dark Rhapsody had obtained quite a bit of detailed information on Zero Wing from the main continent's superpowers and knew the guild had a plethora of astounding trump cards. The Ring of Gospel, a domain treasure, was one of them. When activated on a large battlefield, it had proven miraculously effective. Not only did the Ring of Gospel have large AoE skills, but they were also considerably powerful. However, the ring's effects on this battlefield would be very limited. Zero Wing currently faced Tier 3 personal guards and Tier 4 summoned creatures after all. They had incredible resistance to suppression effects. Moreover, more than 50 Tier 4 summoned creatures had joined the fight. Even if the Ring of Gospel could suppress them, a measly 1,000 plus Tier 3 NPCs wouldn't be enough to stop them. The invading army also had over 3,000 Tier 3 personal guards to support it. Even Graceful Monarch and Purple Rakshasa, who watched from a hidden location, were confused. What is Black Flame trying to do? Is he going for broke? They had only come to get a glimpse of the Dark World's strength. They had never dreamed that they'd witness a large-scale war between Zero Wing and the Otherworld. They had been unprecedentedly shocked after seeing Zero Wing's combat power. No one had expected the guild to have the strength to stand up to a force that included every expert from an entire Otherworld. Moreover, Zero Wing had even successfully deterred the Dark World's experts. The guild's strength was unbelievable. When they recalled the relatively amicable relationship between their Extreme Light Shelter and Shelter 1, they breathed a sigh of relief. If Zero Wing wanted to, its Night Division alone was more than capable of flattening the entire Dark Denver. On the other hand, Zero Wing's current opponents were bona fide Tier 3 NPCs and Tier 4 mythic monsters. With such a large difference between the two sides' combat power and numbers, retreating to Stone Forest City was the wisest move Zero Wing could make. Every one of those Tier 3 knights was a part of Zero Wing's foundations, and if they were slain, Zero Wing would be crippled. Zero Wing had already proven its strength. Once news of this battle spread, the various superpowers that wanted to capture Stone Forest City would back down. The Dark World's players and powers wouldn't underestimate Zero Wing again. In fact, they might even avoid offending the guild's members in Cold Spring Forest. While Graceful Monarch and Purple Rakshasa were fraught with confusion, something suddenly changed above the valley. A phantom world gradually descended, growing as it grew closer to the valley floor. In less than 3 seconds, not only had the phantom world grown large enough to cover the battlefield, but it also enveloped the spectating players, including Graceful Monarch and Purple Rakshasa in the distance. The instant they felt the phantom world's power, both Graceful Moon and Purple Rakshasa felt out of tune with the world around them. It felt like they had become enemies with their surroundings. Not only had their physique started to weaken, but they also lost a significant portion of their basic attributes. The Phantom World's power also seemed to affect the Tier 3 personal guards and Tier 4 summoned creatures. They had slowed considerably and their auras even seemed significantly weaker. What did he do? Blue Rainbow gaped, shocked when she realized how much the Tier 3 NPCs and Tier 4 monsters had been suppressed. She had experienced domain's effects before, which tended to be much weaker than magic barriers. The stronger the target was, the less the domain would suppress it. Yet Shifeng's domain had destroyed everything she thought she knew about the mechanic. Normally, not even intermediate magic arrays could suppress Tier 4 monsters to this extent, but within Shifeng's domain, their auras had weakened considerably. This domain could practically rival advanced magic barriers, and it was so massive that it covered the entire valley. He had never heard of such a powerful domain. Before anyone could react, however, Shifeng began another incantation. Ring of Brilliance. When he finished his chant, a light rippled across the battlefield, stunning every dark player in the area. Crap. This is cheating. Magic Flash cursed aloud, glaring at Zero Wing's Night Division. The intensity of those knights' auras had skyrocketed, and the combined energy made them feel as if they were truly a legion of Tier 4 monsters. The knights' mental states had also visibly improved. They looked nothing like they had a few moments ago. The sudden development caused an uproar among the various guilds and adventurer teams' upper echelons, who commanded the Tier 3 personal guards and Tier 4 summoned creatures, and they halted their advance, exchanging looks. A deathly silence had fallen over the Dark World's invading army, and the passion and killing intent they had radiated was nowhere to be seen. Do you wish to continue this fight? Shifeng calmly asked after sweeping his gaze over the dark players before him. This time not one dark player dared to speak up. They simply stared back with angry, reluctant looks. Fight. More like suicide. Determined, they had revealed every trump card they had previously hidden, and yet thanks to the Ring of Gospel's 2 skills, they hadn't even shortened the gap between their strength and Zero Wings. Rather, it had only grown. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Since no one responded to his question, Shifeng turned to Dawn Dominance, who still succumbed to his shock. Guild Leader Dawn, since you can speak on behalf of the Dark World, may I know if you wish to continue this battle? Shifeng asked, smiling at the robust man. Dawn Dominance's countenance turned ashen when he heard the question, and he was at a complete loss for words. If he chose to fight, he'd be sacrificing himself and his guild to oblivion. He had dispatched every Tier 3 personal guard world domination owned for the sake of driving the other guilds and adventurer teams into action. If just one of those NPCs died, his guild would suffer a huge blow. If they all died, world domination wouldn't survive. However, nothing would remain of world domination's hard-won prestige in the Dark World if he admitted defeat. Chapter 2567. Suppressing an army of millions. Upon hearing the question Shifeng directed at Dawn Dominance, silence fell over the battlefield as the various powers' upper echelons turned to look at world domination's guild leader, who served as the Dark World's representative. Zero Wing's strength had far exceeded their expectations. The guild possessed not only an incredibly strong Knight division but also a domain treasure capable of significantly suppressing even Tier 4 creatures. The combination of the 2 cards meant no power could threaten Zero Wing's Knight Legion at this stage of the game. For a time, silence reigned over the Dark World's army of several millions because of Shifeng's words. This situation stupefied Magic Flash and the others, who were spectating the battle from afar. Arrogance, ignorance. When Magic Flash and the others thought back to the opinions they had of Shifeng, they realized how ridiculous those were. At the same time, they celebrated inwardly. This was because they finally saw for themselves what a true monster was today. Previously, in their opinion, single-handedly going up against thousands of enemies simultaneously could already be considered a legendary feat. In fact, 99% of the people who claimed to be capable of such a feat were undoubtedly spouting nonsense. As expert players, Magic Flash and his companions knew just how difficult it was to go up against thousands of enemies simultaneously, especially in a large-scale guild war. The enemy side would definitely have numerous expert players amidst their forces. Trying to fight against thousands in such a situation ramped up the difficulty. Now, however, not only did this legendary feat happen right before their very eyes, but the scale of this feat had even been magnified by 1,000. Shifeng had single-handedly suppressed an army of millions. Due to just this one scene, they could say with certainty that the name of Black Flame would shake the entire Dark World in the future. Is he really human? Purple Rakshas's heart pounded rapidly as she took in the army of millions remaining motionless before Shifeng. At this moment she earnestly doubted Shifeng was human. He had intimidated several million expert players and several thousand Tier 3 NPCs. Although Shifeng's previous performance at the Extreme Light Shelter had already been plenty shocking, that feat was nothing compared to this. Even standing a great distance away, she had still shuddered upon sighting the army of millions. Shifeng, however, had single-handedly silenced these several million experts. The power and influence he wielded were simply inhuman. It seems Shelter 1 no longer has to worry about its development from now on, Graceful Monarch said, a bitter smile forming on her face as she gazed at Blue Frost, one of her rivals in the Dark Den. Originally, Graceful Monarch thought that with Crimson Emperor's help, the Extreme Light Shelter could surpass Shelter 1 in the Dark Denver. In light of the turn of events, however, that was categorically impossible. Zero Wing was a guild capable of suppressing an entire world's players to the point where they didn't even dare to breathe. Once news of this feat reached the Dark Den, the experts that revered strength would definitely do everything they could to join Shelter 1 and Zero Wing. Moreover, Shifeng had previously displayed extraordinary individual strength in the Dark Denver. With these two factors combined, Shelter 1 would surely become a sacred land for Dark Den's experts. After the silence on the battlefield persisted for some time, Dawn Dominance walked up to Shifeng with an incomparably gloomy expression. The pride and fighting spirit he had before were nowhere to be seen now. Guild leader Black Flame, this move of yours is indeed amazing. I'm afraid nobody ever thought that Zero Wing might actually possess so much hidden strength, Dawn Dominance said after taking a deep breath. However, it is wise not to bum one's bridges. I admit that the domain skills you used are very powerful. However, these domain skills will only remain active so long as their user is alive. Once the user dies, the effects of the domain skills will disappear. The Dark World's army might not be a match for your army, but we have plenty of people. We have more than enough manpower to spare to kill you, the user of the domain skills. Of course, I also have to admit that we will suffer plenty of losses before we succeed. However, the final outcome is similarly one that you will not wish to see, Guild Leader Black Flame. Instead of suffering mutual destruction, why don't we each take a step back? Our request is very simple. So long as Zero Wing stops having designs on the teleportation gate, everything else is negotiable. Upon hearing Dawn Dominance's suggestion, realization immediately dawned upon the dark players present. Guild leader Dawn really is the best. How could we have forgotten such a thing? Due to the immense shock they felt before, one simple thing actually slipped their minds. In God's domain, magic arrays and domain skills required a user to sustain them. Domain tools were no exception. If they killed the player using the tool, then the tool would naturally lose effect. Meanwhile, once the Dark Army no longer suffered under the effects of Miniature World, taking care of Zero Wing would be a piece of cake. However, Dawn Dominance was also correct in that they would have to pay a huge price to annihilate Zero Wing if they continued fighting, and this was not something they wished to see. The best solution now was for both sides to each take a step back. What if I refuse? Shifeng asked, smiling. At Shifeng's words, silence filled the battlefield once more. Lunatic. He's definitely a lunatic. The Dark World has already taken a step back, yet he's still insisting on controlling the teleportation gate. Is he really not afraid of losing everything? The spectating experts of the various superpowers found Shifeng's intransigence insane. Previously, the Dark World's offer to give up on participating in the superpowers fight for Stone Forest City was already plenty shocking. Now the Dark World was even willing to take another step back and provide Zero Wing with other benefits in exchange for Zero Wing giving up its designs on the teleportation gate. In the eyes of the main continent's various superpowers, this was an unbelievable opportunity, something any power would wish to obtain, yet Shifeng had still rejected it without hesitation. They had no doubt that this was the Dark World's bottom line. There would be no more concessions after this. If Shifeng continued insisting on taking control of the teleportation gate, then Zero Wing really would enter an irreconcilable feud with the Dark World. Guild leader Black Flame, do you really intend to drag Zero Wing into a fight to the death? Dawn Dominance demanded as he tried to suppress the anger in his heart as much as possible. You'll regret it if that happens. Zero Wing's strength thoroughly exceeded Dawn Dominance's expectations. If both sides continued fighting, the only outcome would be mutual destruction, an outcome he was not willing to see. After all, world domination still needed to develop on the main continent. Without sufficient strength, its efforts would be futile. However, he never imagined that Shifeng would actually be so stubborn as to refuse to take a step back even when given an excellent opportunity to do so. Guild Leader Dawn, there's no need to continue showing Black Flame any respect. Since he doesn't know how to appreciate goodwill, I say that we just teach him a lesson. At worst, we'll have a slower time developing on the main continent. That's right. Since he doesn't want the goodwill we're showing him, let's just annihilate Zero Wing and be done with this. Let's see what he can do then. The dark players present similarly grew enraged at Shifeng's response. They had already offered a huge concession to Zero Wing, a condition that even super guilds wouldn't dream of obtaining, yet Shifeng had still chosen to reject it. This rekindled the various powers' thoughts of annihilating Zero Wing. A fight to the death? Shaking his head, Shifeng said, Guild Leader Dawn, you're over-exaggerating things. In my eyes, it is, at most, negligible losses. Good. Since you wish to remain stubborn, you have only yourself to blame, Guild Leader Black Flame. Brothers, no need to hold back anymore. Dawn Dominance snarled as he glared at Shifeng in anger. Negligible losses? Such arrogance. Shifeng was simply too arrogant. However, just as the Dark World's army was about to advance once more, Shifeng made his move. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. EU Unsheathing Killing Ray, Shifeng executed a forward slash. Lightning slash. A blue lightning bolt promptly streaked through the area before Shifeng. A bystander would also see a pitch-black spatial tear following closely behind the lightning bolt. Without Dawn Dominance noticing, both the lightning bolt and spatial tear brushed past his body. When the lightning bolt disappeared, the dozen or so Tier 3 experts in its path instantly lost all their HPs. An 80-meter-tall, level 115 mythic monster standing a short distance behind Dawn Dominance was also sent flying and crashing into a bunch of dark players. For a time, deathly silence filled the battlefield. Chapter 2568, Dark World defeated. Zero Wing flourishes. After a short period of stunned silence, a gabble of confusion erupted as everyone present stared at Shifeng in disbelief. What happened? How did he send a Tier 4 summoned creature flying? What did he do? Everyone present had seen Shifeng's actions very clearly. In fact, they even felt that Shifeng had moved very slowly. However, nobody could wrap their heads around what had actually happened. All they had seen was Shifeng executing a forward slash at the empty space before him and releasing a streak of blue light from his sword. And by the time they snapped out of their daze, the Tier 4 summoned creature that stood over 60 yards away from the swordsman was already in the air. He sent a level 115 Tier 4 summoned creature flying with a single hit? Blue Rainbow wore a somber and confused look on her face as she gazed at Shifeng. Just how high are his basic attributes? From previous investigations, she knew that Shifeng possessed ridiculously high basic attributes. Even Rebellious Thunder, who was a demon count and wielded the magic weapon Cruel Darkness, had only a slight edge on Shifeng in this regard. Moreover, that was when Shifeng was in his normal state. In other words, even back then, Shifeng's strength attribute should already rival that of mythic monsters of the same level. Now, however, Shifeng had actually sent a level 115 mythic monster flying with his attack. Something was wrong with this situation. After all, blocking an attack from a mythic monster and sending a mythic monster flying were two entirely different concepts. Unless there was an enormous gap in strength, it was impossible for one to send their opponents flying, yet not only did Shifeng send a mythic monster flying, but it was even a level 115 mythic monster. The current strength he displayed was starkly different from what the reports mentioned. How is this possible? Furious Heart, who was spectating from afar, was similarly stunned by this situation. He had personally witnessed Shifeng's strength before. However, despite so little time having passed since their last meeting, Shifeng could now actually send a level 115 mythic monster flying with his attacks. For a moment, Furious Heart suspected that the main god system was playing a prank on him. With such frightening strength, let alone Tier 3 NPCs, even Tier 4 NPCs would struggle to deal with Shifeng. Needless to say, it would be a fool's dream to hope that a bunch of Tier 4 mythic monsters would defeat him. Monsters generally had very low combat standards. In a situation where the difference in basic attributes was negligible, they would be no different from common monsters in front of even ordinary expert players, let alone a domain realm expert like Shifeng. If all 50+ Tier 4 summoned creatures attacked the swordsman, they would still have an incredibly difficult time inflicting damage on him. Not to mention Shifeng still had a legion of Tier 3 knights behind him. How did he get so strong? Rush, who stood among Zero Wing's forces, was similarly astounded as he looked at Shifeng. Ever since Netherworld Empire had partnered with Zero Wing, Rush had been following beside Shifeng almost every day. Hence he had a very good understanding of Shifeng's strength. Moreover, Shifeng had spent much less time grinding than Rush. In fact, Rush had rarely ever seen Shifeng going out to grind for levels, as the man was tied down by all sorts of guild affairs. In contrast, Rush had been frantically grinding every day. And thanks to Stone Forest City's help, not only was he close to reaching level 110 already, but he had even replaced 2 pieces of his equipment thus far. He had also achieved considerable progress in unlocking his mana body. Personally, he deemed that the gap in combat power between himself and Shifeng should have shrunk by quite a bit. However, contrary to Rush's belief, not only had the gap in combat power not shrunk, but it had actually grown instead. As for Dawn Dominance, who originally planned to ridicule Shifeng for his arrogance and ignorance, he was stunned by this unexpected development as well. When he saw the Tier 4 summoned creature sprawled on the ground, his mind froze momentarily. Dawn Dominance had known that Shifeng possessed basic attributes rivaling those of mythic monsters, and that the man was considered a peerless monster in God's domain. The swordsman definitely wasn't an existence that ordinary experts could hope to contend with. Even a group of Tier 3 peak experts wouldn't be his match. However, what was up with the current situation? How was Shifeng just a peerless monster? He was much stronger than even Zero Wing's nigh-invincible Tier 3 knights. In fact, killing several hundred of Zero Wing's Tier 3 knights would be much easier than killing Shifeng. At this moment, only Shifeng himself remained unfazed by the latest development. In God's domain, weapons played the biggest role in determining a player's combat power. The Abyssal Blade's recent promotion into a fragmented legendary weapon had boosted Shifeng's strength beyond that of level 115 mythic monsters. With the Ring of Gospel's assistance, which weakened the Dark Army's Tier 4 summoned creatures and improved his own basic attributes by a significant margin, it was only natural that he could send a level 115 mythic monster flying. Guild Leader Dawn, do you still wish to continue? Shifeng asked the motionless man before him. This time Shifeng did not speak that loudly. However, the dark players found his voice unusually ear-piercing and vexing. This was already Shifeng's second time asking them this question. It was as if he was ridiculing them for their previous mockery of him, and they could not help but wish they could charge forward and kill Shifeng right now. Humiliation. This was absolute humiliation. Nevertheless, despite feeling greatly humiliated, none of the dark players present dared to speak up. Instead, they all stared at Dawn Dominance in silence. Meanwhile, after Shifeng repeated his question, an indescribably gloomy expression appeared on Dawn Dominance's face. Black flame. Dawn Dominance gnashed his teeth as he glared at Shifeng. However, aside from calling out Shifeng's name, he couldn't think of anything else to say. In this situation, the upper echelons of the Dark World's various powers sympathized with Dawn Dominance despite themselves. Previously, Dawn Dominance's bid to increase world domination's influence in the Dark World through this war had exasperated the various powers present. This was especially true for Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society. Currently, however, both Blue Rainbow and Elder Gold only felt pity for Dawn Dominance. After all, Shifeng was truly too vicious. By deliberately repeating his question, not only did Shifeng thoroughly humiliate Dawn Dominance, but Dawn Dominance also had no choice but to stomach this humiliation in silence. Guild Leader Dawn, if you wish to continue fighting, I won't object. Only the outcome will not be within my control, Shifeng said and shrugged as he looked at Dawn Dominance's enraged expression, indicating that he had no qualms whatsoever. Upon hearing Shifeng's words, the upper echelons of the Dark World's various guilds and adventurer teams immediately grew nervous, and they all sent meaningful looks at Dawn Dominance. The Zero Wing members and various superpowers spectating experts present gaped in shock at this sight. The dark world that had once stricken fear into the main continent's various superpowers was now timorous after a few words from Shifeng. If they were to retell today's tale, nobody would believe them. However, it had happened right before their very eyes. Of course, the various superpowers experts could sympathize with the dark world's players. The current battle involved the foundations of both sides. If the Dark Army perished, then the dark world's various powers would lose all the fruits of their efforts, with nothing to show for it. This definitely wasn't an outcome they could accept. Guild leader Blackflame, I admit that you are very powerful. The dark world will give up on this teleportation gate. However, don't think you can feel pleased for long. You won't be able to defend this teleportation gate forever. Dawn Dominance said after taking in a deep breath. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. As soon as Dawn Dominance finished speaking, he turned around and walked back to the teleportation gate. He had no intention of staying in Cold Spring Forest for even a moment longer. Upon seeing this, the members of the Dark World's powers promptly withdrew to the Dark World as well. None of them chose to remain in Cold Spring Forest. Only a few independent players decided to stay behind and take a look at the situation. Zero Wing won just like that? Purple Rakshasa was stunned when she saw the Dark World's various powers retreating. For a moment she felt as if she was dreaming. Against an entire world's experts, Zero Wing had actually emerged victorious. Chapter 2569, Gathering for Nothing? Cold Spring Forest, Stone Forest City. As news of the Dark World's teleportation gates opening had already spread across the entire Cold Spring Forest, the tension in Stone Forest City had increased, and many of the city's resident players had decided to leave and develop somewhere else. This development left the once bustling city quiet. Stone Forest City's previously crowded main street now had less than half the players it originally did. Moreover, it was only because of the newly established Freedom Hotel that this many players chose to remain in the city. However, the majority of these players were actually experts belonging to the various major powers. Very few were independent players. At this time, a group of cloaked players entered the Freedom Hotel's first-floor lobby, the appearance of these players triggering loud discussions among the other players there. The reason for the strong reaction was the secret pavilion's experts guiding this group of nearly 100 cloaked players. Standing at the head of the secret pavilion's experts were the well-known Xianxia and a male half-elf who looked to be in his 40s. Amazing! Who are those people? They're actually being guided by an elder of the secret pavilion. Those people must be big shots of superpowers. I recall that the secret pavilion is a shareholder of Stone Forest City. Now that the Dark World's players have entered Cold Spring Forest, Stone Forest City faces a very bleak future. Those cloaked people might be reinforcements the secret pavilion recruited. Reinforcements? What's the point of calling in reinforcements? That's an entire world we're talking about. That's not something any individual superpower can go up against. Even multiple superpowers working together won't be able to stop the Dark World's invasion. The various major powers experts in the lobby were eaten up with curiosity as they discussed the identities of the cloaked experts. Nowadays, Stone Forest City was already a holy land for players who wanted to develop themselves. After all, the city boasted not only an incredibly high mana density but also the Freedom Hotel, which greatly amplified the rate at which players accumulated the double EXP buff. It was even rumored that the Freedom Hotel's top-floor rooms could accelerate the removal of foreign energy from one's body and increase the efficiency of one's training in combat techniques. In the current era, where combat techniques had become more commonly available in God's domain, the Freedom Hotel's functions held a fatal temptation to expert players. If a power could develop their expert players using the Freedom Hotel's functions over long periods, the development speed of said power would reach unimaginable heights. Since the secret pavilion was one of Stone Forest City's shareholders, the guild naturally wouldn't give up on the city without a fight. Only now that the Dark World's teleportation gate was open, the various major powers experts found it inconceivable that any power could stop the Dark World's players. Please wait a moment. I'll go rent an advanced reception room, Xianxia said to the cloaked players behind him. He went up to the front desk and presented a gold card to the receptionist there. And upon seeing the card, the various major powers' upper echelons were green with envy. The Freedom Hotel's gold membership card. Due to the Freedom Hotel's amazing functions, the various major powers all sought membership in the Freedom Hotel, the higher the better. However, doing so was incredibly difficult. Even now, those major powers had managed to gain only a bronze membership. If they wished to elevate their membership status to silver, they would need to accumulate a large number of contribution points in the Freedom Hotel, which could be acquired only by selling rare materials and doing quests. Moreover, each player could sell only a limited amount of materials per day. Meanwhile, a gold membership allowed players to rent the rooms on the Freedom Hotel's top floor. While Yuan Tiexin was handling the rental procedures, the cloaked players standing behind him studied the Freedom Hotel's interior. "So this is Zero Wing's Freedom Hotel? This place really is amazing," said a cloaked, male youth radiating dense darkness energy. He sighed ruefully when he sensed the density of the mana inside the hotel and the mana's effects. "It's no wonder Zero Wing dared to offend our guild before. So what if Zero Wing dared to offend us?" In the end, Zero Wing still lost to Vice Guild leader Light, a level 109 elementalist standing beside the male youth and similarly radiating darkness energy said disdainfully. This time, the secret pavilion had not only taken the initiative to invite the various superpowers that Demon's Heart had secretly partnered up with but also extended an invitation to Demon's Heart. One could easily imagine the direness of Zero Wing's current situation. Unfortunately, even if the secret pavilion stepped forward this time, it couldn't do much to change the outcome of this war, as the various superpowers present were hell-bent on obtaining Stone Forest City. As the two experts from Demon's Heart quietly conversed with each other, Illusory Words, who similarly stood among the cloaked players, wore a frown on her face. "Illusory, it seems the chances of Zero Wing surviving are slim. So many superpowers have actually gathered to obtain Stone Forest City. I doubt even the secret pavilion expected such a development," the fierce man standing beside Illusory Words said, sighing. The secret pavilion had invited all the superpowers targeting Stone Forest City to the negotiations. Crimson Emperor had estimated that 6 or 7 superpowers at most had their eye on Stone Forest City. However, the actual number turned out to be more than 10. Even Battle Wolves, which had an irreconcilable feud with Demon's Heart, had decided to join in the fray. If these superpowers banded together, they would have a minimum of 4,000 Tier 3 experts with very high combat standards. If they worked together with the Dark World's forces and attacked Stone Forest City from both the inside and outside, Stone Forest City wouldn't stand a chance. Of course, the fierce man could also understand why the various superpowers were willing to go to such lengths to obtain Stone Forest City. After all, the advantages the city brought were simply amazing. This was especially true for the Freedom Hotel. No superpower would pass up the Freedom Hotel's benefits. Moreover, Zero Wing had even taken the initiative to meet the Dark World's army at the teleportation gate. That was simply suicide. Now, even if all of the 5 great super guilds banded together, they still wouldn't be able to save Zero Wing. At this moment, let alone Illusory Words and the fierce man from Crimson Emperor, even Yuan Tiexin, who had invited the various superpowers secretly targeting Stone Forest City, was surprised by this situation. He never thought that there would be more than 10 superpowers targeting Stone Forest City this time. Aside from Demon's Heart and Starlink, which bore deep hatred for Zero Wing, the superpowers included the Ten Saints Empire's Demon Palace, the Shadow World's Shadowless Empire, and the Super Guilds Battle Wolves and Pantheon. Not to mention Mythology, one of the 5 great super guilds, which wasn't present among the superpowers he invited, was sure to be taking action in secret against Stone Forest City as well. If all these superpowers worked together, they could shake the entire eastern continent, what more a measly Stone Forest City. For a moment, Yuan Tiexin could not help but doubt if the negotiations this time would truly yield any results. Zero Wing is doomed now. Troubled Times, who had come with flaming light, could not help but grow ecstatic as he took in the various superpowers representatives around him. With so many superpowers gathered here, even a super guild won't be able to stop the upcoming assault. Previously, when Shifeng had publicly executed Troubled Times in Demon City, not only did Troubled Times' strength diminish greatly, but his reputation in the Dark Den had also fallen into ruin. Originally, Troubled Times thought that he wouldn't have an opportunity to get revenge on Zero Wing. However, his chance had come so quickly. "Everyone, the reception room is ready. Please follow me," Yuan Tiexin said to the cloaked group behind him. However, just as Yuan Tiexin was about to lead the group to the Freedom Hotel's top-floor reception room, a figure suddenly appeared before him. The other players present in the lobby gaped in shock at the development. The players the secret pavilion invited might be hiding their identities, but they had not done anything to conceal their auras. And their auras made it clear that every one of these people was a peak expert or above. Anyone that dared to stand in their path had to be tired of living. However, someone actually dared to do so. Moreover, this person was a woman wearing Zero Wings emblem, and her level was only a pitiful 100. Miss Melancholic, do you have business with us? Xianxia asked in confusion. He had recognized this woman immediately. This woman was none other than Melancholic Smile, the manager of Zero Wings candlelight trading firm as well as one of the Freedom Hotel's managers. Xianxia had not intentionally tried to conceal the fact that he had invited the various superpowers for negotiations. And in his opinion, Zero Wing should have no reason whatsoever to stop him from doing so. After all, the secret pavilion was one of Stone Forest City's shareholders, and negotiating with the various superpowers could reduce the number of enemies Zero Wing would have to face. Now, however, Melancholic Smile had suddenly appeared before their group. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. It's nothing important, Melancholic Smile said, shaking her head. I'm just following the guild leader's instructions to relay a message to these people. Relay a message? Is he taking the initiative to hand over Stone Forest City's shares now that he knows he can't win? Troubled Times asked, laughing in ridicule. Upon hearing Troubled Times' words, the various superpowers experts present also started laughing. With things having reached this point already, wasn't it a little too late for regrets? Our guild leader has stated that if you wish to develop in Stone Forest City with peace in mind, then Zero Wing will welcome you with open arms. However, if you wish to meddle in Stone Forest City's affairs, you'd best return to wherever you came from instead of asking for trouble. Melancholic Smile declared calmly as she swept her gaze across the players before her. Chapter 2570, On the Verge of War, Crazy Zero Wing. At first, the players in the lobby had paid close attention to the mysterious group Xianxia had invited, and Melancholic Smile hadn't tried to keep her voice down. Hence, after her declaration, silence had fallen in the hotel lobby as everyone stared at her in astonishment. What's going on? Those people must be big shots from the various superpowers, yet she dares to speak to them like that? Amazing. Truly amazing. Even now, Zero Wing still behaves so haughtily. Since the day I joined God's domain, I've never seen such a suicidal guild. None of these players were fools, and even though they hid themselves under black cloaks, the individuals Xianxia had invited were clearly from the various superpowers. Moreover, they should be the superpowers' top-ranked experts based on their auras. Now that the Dark World's teleportation gate was active, it would only be a matter of time before dark players flooded into Cold Spring Forest. The entire level 100 neutral map was in danger, as was Stone Forest City. Yet even in such a dire predicament, Zero Wing continued to maintain its arrogance before the various superpowers. This was just insane. Miss Melancholic, what are you? Xianxia was flabbergasted. He couldn't believe what was happening. If he hadn't been certain that Melancholic Smile wasn't some spy and an actual core member in Zero Wing, who had worked her way up the ranks, he would have suspected otherwise. Her announcement was practically a dare to the various superpowers and would undoubtedly lead to Zero Wing's elimination from Cold Spring Forest. What are Zero Wing's intentions, old Yuan? Scorching Shine asked from beside Xianxia with a frosty look. He had already surmised that the chances of their plan succeeding were very low. Stone Forest City's Freedom Hotel was too tempting to give up after all. However, it was also the reason that the secret pavilion didn't want other superpowers to stick their fingers in the city. Unfortunately, Melancholic Smile's statement had as good as ruined their plan. No one would be surprised if the various superpowers shed all pretenses with Zero Wing immediately, let alone negotiate. For a moment, Xianxia was speechless. Cold Spring Forest was a lost cause at this point. Even the various superpowers would have a hard time developing in the area, much less Zero Wing. There was simply no way Zero Wing could retain absolute control over Stone Forest City. It'd be a miracle if the guild even kept a portion of the city. Xianxia had worked with Shifeng many times before, so he knew the swordsman was open to persuasion, not coercion. If he insisted that Shifeng gave away a significant portion of the city's shares, their discussion would end on a sour note. Knowing this, he hadn't bothered to contact Shifeng before his negotiation with the various superpowers. He would only try to convince Shifeng once the negotiations had reached a satisfying conclusion. With things as they were now, Zero Wing would have to sacrifice some of Stone Forest City's shares if it wished to survive. Maintaining full control was impossible. But Yuan Tianxin had never considered that Shifeng would be ruthless enough to send Melancholic Smile to disrespect the various superpowers so blatantly. He had definitely gone insane this time. Haha. Interesting. Zero Wing is truly fascinating. Even now it displays such confidence. It's no wonder why it dares to offend so many superpowers. It seems my visit to Stone Forest City wasn't a waste. An elderly crimson-eyed man wearing the Shadowless Empire's emblem and holding a scarlet staff said, laughing. Old Lu, do you think Zero Wing is just putting on a brave face? Evil Qilin, who wore Demon Palace's emblem and carried a war axe that radiated strange energy, asked, sneering at the crimson-browed elder. Zero Wing is digging its own grave by provoking us. I think you still have a grudge over losing to Black Flame Qilin, the crimson-eyed elder shot back, chuckling at the glare Evil Qilin directed his way. Instead of rising to the crimson-eyed elder's teasing, Evil Qilin simply smiled as he said, the situation on Dragonheart Island is one thing, but we're in Cold Spring Forest. Moreover, this won't be some small team battle in the fields. We're talking about a conflict with an entire otherworld. Zero Wing hasn't tried to win us over, but has sent some nobody to spit in our faces. If that isn't stupidity, what is? Demon Palace's other members nodded in agreement. Due to Zero Wing, Demon Palace's reputation on Dragonheart Island had suffered, but this situation was completely different. More than 10 superpowers had gathered in Stone Forest City. Even without including the Dark Worlds players, there were more than enough hostile players to end Zero Wing's reign. Instead of negotiating for peace, Zero Wing has sent someone to slap the gathered superpowers in the face. The guild must be giving up. After a brief moment of silence, Troubled Time's smile grew into a grin. He then walked up to Melancholic Smile without any hesitation. Lady from Zero Wing, we're here precisely to cause trouble. What are you going to do about it? Troubled Times asked, raising his voice deliberately to ensure that every player in the lobby heard him. Hearing Troubled Time's threat, an uproar shook the lobby. What? Are the various superpowers really going to fight Zero Wing? Zero Wing asked for it. We may be in Stone Forest City, but do you think the various superpowers would let such intentional disrespect slide? Zero Wing truly is doomed now. Now, not only does it have to deal with the Dark World's invasion, but it will also have to face the various superpowers' wrath. The experts that recently joined Zero Wing must deeply regret their decisions. The various major powers members started chatting amongst themselves as they watched the tense conversation play out. They could hardly believe Zero Wing's behavior. None of them had expected the guild to shed all pretenses before the various superpowers representatives. While everyone expected Melancholic Smile to panic, however, she smiled brightly at Troubled Times and replied, if that's the case, Zero Wing will have no choice but to erase you from Cold Spring Forest. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. You again. The lobby fell deathly silent. Melancholic Smile's response even stunned Troubled Times. He couldn't understand why she was so bold. Wasn't she supposed to grovel at his feet and beg for mercy? It seems your instincts were wrong this time, Illusory. That girl is just as insane as her guild leader. She's only pushing Zero Wing further down the path of no return. The fierce man from Crimson Emperor said, admiring Melancholic Smile's bravery. Every one of the various superpowers representatives wanted to declare war on Zero Wing that moment. They hadn't found a good excuse to attack Stone Forest City yet, but Zero Wing had just given them the reason they had been searching for. The fierce man looked over, expecting to see Illusory words bitter after misjudging Zero Wing, but he saw that she maintained a neutral expression, focused on a message she had just received. After a moment, she looked up and took a deep breath before informing her companion, my instincts might have been wrong, but her statement isn't. Chapter 2571. Astonished once more. Hotel in an uproar. What do you mean? Illusory Word's statement confused her fierce comrade from Crimson Emperor. What did she mean by her instincts had been wrong, but Melancholic Smile wasn't? The current situation was clear for all to see, and Illusory Words had acknowledged that she had misjudged Zero Wing. How could Melancholic Smile's statement possibly be correct? Zero Wing was struggling to survive. Chasing the various superpowers out of Cold Spring Forest from such a position was a joke. To be precise, my instincts were only partially correct, Illusory Words explained, chuckling at the fierce man's confused look. It's best if you take a look for yourself. I just received this message from Graceful Monarch. Graceful Monarch? Has something unexpected happened at the teleportation gate? Curious, the fierce man opened the message Illusory Words had forwarded. Graceful Monarch and Purple Rakshasa had wanted to see the Dark World's teleportation gate themselves and get a clear grasp of the invading army's strength. Zero Wing had also dispatched quite a few players to the gate, and by allowing the two Dark Den players to spectate, they'd find out exactly what Zero Wing intended. In his opinion, Zero Wing was wasting its time in trying to negotiate with the Dark World's various powers, especially once they'd seen the benefits Cold Spring Forest and Stone Forest City had to offer. Regardless of what the guild tried to offer, the outcome wouldn't change. Retaining a small fraction of the city's shares was the best Zero Wing could hope for. It shouldn't dream of holding more power than that. The Dark World's invading army had more than 30,000 Tier 3 experts. No individual power would have the strength to stand up against that. While the fierce man carefully read Graceful Monarch's message, more players had begun to gather in the Freedom Hotel. A large number of independent experts had come to hear what Melancholic Smile had to say. Did she get the wrong message? Dropping all pretense with the various superpowers would only bring Zero Wing more harm. Stone Forest City might not even last 3 days at this rate, much less a week. Galaxy Past, who had just arrived in the Freedom Hotel's lobby, gaped in shock when he heard about Melancholic Smile's interaction with the superpowers representatives. Every player in the city was paying attention to the current situation Zero Wing and Cold Spring Forest faced. Although word of the various superpowers moving against Stone Forest City had long since reached the masses, Galaxy Past still had a hard time believing that Zero Wing would take the initiative to offend the various superpowers. He too knew that Zero Wing would never bend to coercion, only persuasion. He also knew that the guild was insane and acted no differently than a gambling addict. Although Zero Wing's crazy bets had been astonishingly successful thus far, its current opponent was on a completely different level than those it had faced before. If Zero Wing moved against the various superpowers now, it would be caught in a dead end. Zero Wing was no longer the guild it had been. It had nearly as many resources and as much territory as the various superpowers. If the guild could stabilize its hold in Stone Forest City and continue to develop in peace, it would only be a matter of time before it became another of God's domain's superpowers. While Galaxy Past found Melancholic Smile's actions perplexing, Demon's Heart's members began to laugh. Troubled Time's laughter in particular rang throughout the lobby. He looked at Melancholic Smile as if she were a fool. Truthfully, not even he had expected this development. He had believed this woman would have tried to explain away her statement as a misunderstanding. He had never dreamed that she'd pit herself against the various superpowers directly, removing any room for negotiation. Now that Melancholic Smile had offended the various superpowers, their reputations would suffer if they didn't respond appropriately. Lady from Zero Wing, you certainly are bold. Would you truly kick us out of Cold Spring Forest if we choose to ignore Zero Wing's threat? Do you assume we won't eliminate you just because Zero Wing is the only established guild in Cold Spring Forest? Troubled Times asked, sneering at Melancholic Smile. With things as they were, he didn't mind adding fuel to the fire, ensuring that any trace of Zero Wing would be removed from Cold Spring Forest. Still going to come down to a fight in the end? Yuan Tiexin could not help his bitter smile at Melancholic Smile's fearlessness. Personally, Yuan Tiexin admired Zero Wing's future and Shifeng's strength. Moreover, the secret pavilion had gained quite a bit from its partnership with this guild. Hence he wished to help Zero Wing in any way he could. However, it seemed his recent efforts were for naught. Just as Yuan Tiexin was about to give up and try to find another way to deal with the gathered superpowers, a voice called out from a group of cloaked players, echoing throughout the hotel lobby. Excuse me, Miss Melancholic, but unlike the other superpowers, Battle Wolves is only here in hopes of allying with Zero Wing. I'd like to avoid a misunderstanding. Everyone in the lobby spun to look at the speaker. Several players broke away from the group and removed their black cloaks to reveal their true appearances. A middle-aged man led the small party. It was none other than Sirius, one of the Battle Wolves' 4 Great Wolf Kings. Crap. Battle Wolves has come too? Sure enough, those cloaked players all have powerful backgrounds, but what is Sirius trying to do? He really doesn't plan to target Stone Forest City? Zero Wing is so lucky. Or maybe the guild has a secret relationship with battle wolves, so they've decided to give up on this struggle? Sirius's interruption stunned the players in the lobby. No one had thought that battle wolves, a super guild, would forsake the contest for Stone Forest City. Battle wolves, huh? Even Yuan Tianxin was slightly surprised by Sirius's admission, yet he could understand the reason behind it. Battle wolves and Demon's Heart had an irreconcilable feud. Since Demon's Heart was moving against Zero Wing, it was only natural that battle wolves would interfere. Stepping forward to side with Zero Wing was well within reason. On the other hand, Troubled Times and his Demon's Heart companions were particularly surprised to hear Sirius's declaration. The enemy of my enemy is my friend, after all. As Troubled Times and the others assumed the minor interlude had concluded, another player spoke up from among the crowd. Greetings, Miss Melancholic. Crimson Emperor is here to negotiate with Zero Wing as well. That is our only intention. Those who have spoken out against your guild only represent certain powers. They have no bearing on Crimson Emperor's will, illusory words announced as she stepped forward. For a moment, everyone in the lobby fell silent. What's going on? Crimson Emperor stands by Zero Wing's side too? Not only had Battle Wolves declared its intentions to ally with Zero Wing, but Crimson Emperor had as well. Everyone's eyes nearly fell out of their sockets. Has Crimson Emperor gone mad? Troubled Times stared at illusory words and her entourage in confusion. While he could understand Battle Wolf's decision, he couldn't even fathom what drove Crimson Emperor. Crimson Emperor was neither a friend of Zero Wing's nor Demon's Heart's enemy, yet it was showing strong support for the former. The situation was baffling. Of course, while the two guilds allying themselves with Zero Wing was unexpected, it wouldn't affect the overall situation. Before anyone could overcome their surprise, however, several more players spoke up from among the cloaked group. Shadowless Empire also wishes to form a partnership. We have only come here with this group due to Old Yuan's invitation. Young lady from Zero Wing, please, do not misinterpret our intentions, the crimson-eyed elder from Shadowless Empire declared, stepping away from the group. You really are a sleaze, old Lu. You make it sound as if Demon Palace has some other reason for being here, Evil Qilin said, similarly removing himself from the group as he rolled his eyes at the crimson-eyed elder. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. After the representatives from Shadowless Empire and Demon Palace declared their desire for peace, the other representatives, aside from those from Demon's Heart and Starlink, did the same, insisting to Melancholic Smile that they were only there to seek an alliance with her guild, nothing else. The various major powers members and independent players in the Freedom Hotel's lobby were dumbfounded as they watched the scene play out. What's going on? What has Zero Wing done? Even Yuan Tianxin and Troubled Times watched with their jaws hanging open. They had no idea what was happening either. Chapter 2572, Stone Forest City shaken. Darkness disappears. The situation even confused Melancholic Smile, to say nothing of Yuan Tianxin and Troubled Times. Only a moment ago, these superpowers representatives had been silent, but based on their imposing auras, they had harbored no intentions of allying with Zero Wing. They now displayed a completely different attitude. Before Troubled Times could say anything to these representatives, a hand shot out and stopped him. His mouth clicked shut as he glanced at Flaming Light in confusion. We're leaving. Flaming Light snapped after one last glance at Melancholic Smile. He turned and left the Freedom Hotel without another word. He made no attempts to win back the various superpowers. Are we just going to let Zero Wing off the hook, Vice Guild Leader? Troubled Times whispered to Flaming Light. They had gone to great lengths to gather so many superpowers. Combined with the Dark World's forces, Stone Forest City, even at intermediate rank, was a fish on the cutting board. Most of the superpowers they had gathered may have abandoned the plan to attack Stone Forest City, but they could still cause enough trouble to cost Zero Wing a fortune and accelerate the city's downfall with Starlink, Demon's Heart, and the adventurer team's mythology controlled, even if they couldn't deal a severe blow. Fool. Do you think those superpowers would suddenly change their minds without a reason? Flaming Light growled as he glared at Troubled Times. Have they unearthed some sort of unexpected information? Troubled Times wondered, realization dawning on him. Those superpowers are all sly foxes. No ordinary news could make them change sides so drastically. Something big must have happened with the Dark World, Flaming Light hissed. Something's happened to the Dark World? How is that possible? Troubled Times could not help his skepticism. The Dark World was home to powerful lunatics, where the strong preyed upon the weak. If the Dark World's players wanted to enter Cold Spring Forest, there was no power strong enough to stop them, not even Flaming Light, who was responsible for opening the teleportation gate. I'm not sure yet. I could be overthinking things, Flaming Light said, shaking his head. In reality, he found the deduction hard to believe. We need to send someone to investigate immediately. I'll contact Elder Heart right away, Troubled Times said, nodding. Even after Flaming Light and his entourage left the Freedom Hotel, the lobby was still silent as the various major powers members and independent players remained speechless. Everything had changed too suddenly. A second ago, the various superpowers had been ready to draw their weapons and declare war on Zero Wing, but in the next moment, they voiced their intentions to ally with the guild. The crowd even wondered if those cloaked players were truly upper echelons from the various superpowers or not. What's going on here, Old Yuan? Why are these superpowers behaving like this? Scorching Shine asked, unable to hold back his curiosity any longer. At this moment, Yuan Tiexing was just as confused. He too wished to know what had just changed. Yuan Tiexing struggled to find an answer for Scorched Shine's question when he noticed that he had received a message from Purple Jade some time ago. Could Zero Wing have done something? Realization dawned on Yuan Tiexing when he saw the message. When he had heard that Zero Wing had rashly sent a force to the Dark World's teleportation gate, he had sent Purple Jade to investigate the situation. Since she had messaged him, he found it likely that Zero Wing had done something at the gate which had, in turn, caused this unexpected development. The other superpowers' representatives must also have received news, which had changed their minds. Even if Zero Wing has done something, this outcome shouldn't be possible. Yuan Tiexing felt that something was amiss, and he immediately opened Purple Jade's message. By the time he finished reading her report, he was astounded. Old Yuan, what's happened? Did you get disconnected? Scorching Shine asked when he saw his old comrade's slack expression. Not even Scorching Shine's question shook Yuan Tiexing from his daze. He only opened his mouth after some time and stuttered, "TA1. Zero Wing actually won. Zero Wing won? What did it win?" Scorching Shine prodded. Zero Wing won the Dark World. After taking in a deep breath, Yuan Tiexing clearly explained, Zero Wing just won the Dark World at the teleportation gate. Won the Dark World? Yuan Tiexing's abnormal behavior baffled Scorching Shine. The man was, after all, utterly incoherent. Did he have Alzheimer's? For a moment, Scorching Shine thought it might be time to suggest to his guild leader that Yuan Tiexing take a vacation. Brother Shine, I apologize. I got too excited. Yuan Tiexing apologized when he realized that Scorching Shine was looking at him like a mental patient. Chuckling, he explained, a few minutes ago, Zero Wing led a legion of Tier 3 NPCs and repelled the Dark World's invading army. Dawn Dominance, World Domination's guild leader and the Dark World's representative, has publicly announced their retreat. Zero Wing has taken full control of the Dark World's teleportation gate. Zero Wing has defeated the Dark World's invading army? Are you toying with me, Old Yuan? Scorching Shine questioned, giving Yuan Tiexing a disdainful look. Since Yuan Tiexing hadn't controlled his voice, everyone in the lobby had heard him clearly. A commotion erupted, and the various major powers experts and independent players stared at Yuan Tiexing as if he were a blubbering fool. No individual power in God's domain was capable of standing against the Dark World's invading army. Although Zero Wing had a large number of Tier 3 NPCs under its command, that only amounted to 600. Trying to stop more than 30,000 Tier 3 players with a measly 600 Tier 3 NPCs was a joke. Even if they included every Tier 3 player in Zero Wing, the guild should have no hope of stopping the Dark World's invading army. Furthermore, the various powers that called the Dark World home had extraordinary powers. If they all revealed just one of their many trump cards, they could easily annihilate every player in Cold Spring Forest 10 times over. With such strength, how could Zero Wing possibly defeat this invading army? I knew you wouldn't believe me. Here, take a look. This is the battle video Jade recorded, Yuan Tiexing said, shaking his head helplessly. Yuan Tiexing found the situation just as unbelievable, but with the facts before him, he had no choice but to recognize it as truth. Scorching Shine then watched the video Yuan Tiexing sent him. Silence. Shock. How is this possible? Scorching Shine couldn't believe his eyes. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. They were talking about several million expert players. He also saw several dozen Tier 4 summoned creatures and several thousand Tier 3 personal guards. Yet even with such power, the Dark World's invading army had suffered defeat. Shortly after the video ended, a group of players entered the Freedom Hotel's lobby in a hurry, clearly excited. Big news, everyone. Great news. Zero Wings just repelled the Dark World's invading army and has taken control of the Dark World's teleportation gate. Chapter 2573, Popular Stone Forest City. When the group that had just burst into the Freedom Hotel excitedly announced Zero Wings' victory of the Dark World's invading army, the players in the lobby who had been skeptical about Yuan Tiexian's stunned announcement were flabbergasted. What? It's actually true? How could Zero Wing have possibly won? We're talking about an entire world of experts. The fact that the secret pavilion held some of Stone Forest City's shares was no longer a secret. Thus, there had been a chance that Yuan Tiexian had been lying to boost Zero Wing's reputation. The players that had just arrived, however, were a different story. Every member of the group was an independent player, and a few of them were well known among the adventurer teams unrelated to Zero Wing in the city. Because of this, they were considered quite credible. Most importantly, they had just explained the sudden change in the various superpowers' attitudes regarding Zero Wing. Even with many players still doubting the news, assuming it was either a lie or outrageously exaggerated, there was no doubt that the guild in question had done something to change the superpowers' minds. That fact alone was enough to shock everyone in the lobby only moments before they were overcome with joy. Without the various superpowers' interference and with Stone Forest City's defenses and terrain advantage, even the Dark World's players would need a long time before they could capture the city. Meanwhile, resident players like themselves could safely and far faster than those based outside of Stone Forest City. Thankfully, we weren't too rash, but I really doubt that Zero Wing's foundations are this formidable. Demon's Heart's flaming light must be going mad with regret right about now, the fierce man from Crimson Emperor said with a bitter smile. The main reason that the various superpowers were so afraid of Demon's Heart was the key in Flaming Light's possession, which allowed him to open the Dark World's teleportation gate in any location he desired. If not for this trump card, Demon's Heart wouldn't have developed so smoothly in the Ten Saints Empire. Flaming Light had intended to use this trump card to salvage Demon's Heart's reputation and deter the Ten Saints Empire's various superpowers. But now, both his threat and plans had gone to the dogs. In fact, Flaming Light's trump card had unexpectedly benefited Zero Wing, increasing both the guild's fame and fortune. It was only a matter of time before word of the Dark World's defeat spread across the main continent, and as it did, everyone would learn about Zero Wing. Not even the various superpowers were capable of accomplishing such a feat, yet Zero Wing had succeeded. Although the guild had relied on a large number of Tier 3 NPCs to do so, those NPCs were considered a part of Zero Wing's strength. In addition, with the Dark World's teleportation gate under Zero Wing's control, even ordinary players knew this victory would usher in an era of power for the guild. No one would be surprised if it instantly became a superpower in its own right. And the one who granted Zero Wing this opportunity was none other than Demon's Heart's Flaming Light. That's right. Without the Dark World's assistance, Demon's Heart will have a very hard time expanding in the Ten Saints Empire. Illusory Words agreed, nodding. Demon's Heart had gone out for wool and come home shorn. The Dark World's teleportation gate should have triggered unprecedented change on the main continent. However, Zero Wing now controlled the gate, and the guild had made it clear that it intended to collect a fee from every player that wanted to use the teleportation gate. This would significantly decrease the number of visiting Dark World players and, in turn, reduce the number of Demon's Heart's potential allies. Unless the Dark Guild wanted to face the Ten Saints Empire's various superpowers, it would have to keep a low profile for a considerable amount of time. You've done a great job this time, Illusory. Since the Grand Elders had nearly made such a catastrophic mistake, the guild leader has reclaimed a lot of authority in the guild. The guild leader sent a message ago requesting that you represent Crimson Emperor in the negotiations with Zero Wing. It would also be best if you could rent a few of the Freedom Hotel's rooms long-term. Don't worry about the required money and materials, the fierce man congratulated his comrade. The guild leader's requests are certainly troublesome. Now that Zero Wing has defeated the Dark World, a ton of powers will try to rent a large number of the hotel rooms. Illusory words grumbled, offering a half-hearted smile. With Cold Spring Forest now free of the Dark World's threat, Stone Forest City was, once again, a sacred leveling ground. It would soon become a holy city for the Eastern continent's various powers and independent players. And when it did, even entering the city would become a challenge, let alone renting one of the Freedom Hotel's rooms. Shortly after the various superpowers meeting in the first floor lobby had concluded, news of the Dark World's defeat spread throughout the continent. As they learned of the event, many powers began to regret their decision to abandon Stone Forest City the moment things had turned south. Crap. How is this even possible? Zero Wing is so awesome. Even an entire other world of players is helpless against that guild. Who could possibly stand against it? Stone Forest City? It seems like a good place to develop. When the various kingdoms and empires' powers and independent experts learned about Zero Wing's victory, many of them considered moving their bases of operations to Stone Forest City. Aside from the fact that Stone Forest City occupied a level 100 neutral map, the fact that the Dark World's invading army hadn't been able to shake Zero Wing's foundations made the city incredibly valuable. None of the city's residents would have to worry about suddenly losing their bases or another power taking over, which would render all of their investments useless. This concern was precisely the reason that many players developed in NPC cities, rather than in guild cities. Now that Zero Wing had affirmed its strength, Stone Forest City's stability wasn't a concern. At the very least, it would be a long while before any power could bring harm to the city. This time period would be more than enough for players to earn back what they had invested in the city. For a time, players from various kingdoms and empires swarmed towards Stone Forest City. The abrupt population boom was easily 10 times larger than the initial wave of players that visited the city once it had reached intermediate rank. Moreover, an astounding number of players had begun to apply to the guild. Zero Wing had already received more than 2 million applicants among its various branches, with many of these experts capable of reaching the Trial Tower's 5th floor and beyond. Gentle Snow, Aqua Rose, and Zero Wing's other management personnel were stupefied. No matter how well they had managed Zero Wing in the past, few new experts had applied to join, yet after a single battle, everything had changed. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. EU Guild Leader, Stone Forest City's player population has exceeded 8 million, and I believe even more players are on their way. Should we slightly raise the city's entrance fee? Aqua Rose asked, still blissful after reading the latest statistics report. Their war with the Dark World had ended less than half a day ago, yet Stone Forest City's player population had risen from less than 2 million to over 8 million. The number of players visiting the city had completely exceeded her expectations. No, let's forget about increasing the entrance fee. We still need a large number of independent players to settle down in Stone Forest City. However, we can increase the Freedom Hotel's prices. Don't normal rooms cost 30 silver per day? Raise it to 1 gold. Bronze members will get a 10% discount, silver members will get 20%, and gold members will get 30%. Shifeng decided, chuckling. Nothing in this world came for free. Since the various powers wanted their experts to develop as quickly as possible, he wouldn't be courteous. He was incredibly poor right now after all. To arm his night division he had spent almost all of the money he had. I understand. The pricing astonished Aqua Rose a little. Not even ordinary experts could afford a daily expense of 1 gold. Ah, right. Guild Leader, Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society have contacted me and wish to discuss the offer you made them. They're asking when you'll be free to speak on the matter. Chapter 2574, Ancient Gods Tower, Stone Forest City, Freedom Hotel's top floor reception room. Blue Rainbow from Dark Rhapsody and Elder Gold from Deity Society sat on a sofa, an awkward silence between them, in a spacious, luxurious reception room. Magic Flash and Old Forest sat beside them just as dazed. This was simply too humiliating. They had thought that their previous meeting with Shifeng would have been their last, and they would never have to see each other again. They had seen Shifeng's hope of a stronger partnership between their guilds as nothing more than wishful thinking. However, less than 2 days after that meeting, they had sought the swordsman out again. Meanwhile, Shifeng had transformed his brazen declaration into reality, taking control of the Dark World's teleportation gate and the Otherworld's lifeline. If any of the Dark World's powers or players wanted to continue and accelerate their development, they'd have to travel to Cold Spring Forest. However, Zero Wing's teleportation fees were just fraudulent. The guild actually charged 1 darkness crystal or similarly attributed magic crystal per person. Attributed magic crystals were even rarer than ordinary magic crystals, and dark players needed darkness crystals for their growth. In fact, they needed a lot of them. There weren't even enough darkness crystals to go around for the Dark World's various powers and independent players, yet Zero Wing was cruel enough to charge darkness crystals as its teleportation fee. Worse yet, they couldn't defeat Zero Wing. To secure its hold on the teleportation gate, Zero Wing had established a permanent magic barrier around it, in addition to stationing 2 Crimson Dragon flying ships, 8 combat puppets, 600 Tier 3 knights, and 2,000 Tier 2 knights to guard the gate. The defenses Zero Wing had set up around the teleportation gate were maddening. Sending an army of 20,000 Tier 3 experts would be futile against such high security, much less sneaking through. The only option the Dark World's powers and players had left was to hand over the required fee obediently. After Blue Rainbow and the others waited for a while, the reception room's doors opened abruptly, and Zero Wing's guild leader Black Flame walked in. He was the monster that had single-handedly deterred the Dark World's army of several million players. However, Shifeng seemed like a completely different person at the moment. When he had stood before the Dark World's teleportation gate, he had radiated an incredible aura that frightened everyone in his presence. But now they couldn't even detect the hint of an aura, as if he were just an ordinary player. Similar to Blue Rainbow and the others' first meeting with this swordsman, he seemed harmless. Rather than contempt, however, they only looked at Shifeng with fear in their eyes. They hadn't paid much attention to him during their last meeting, but now that they did, they couldn't even consider Shifeng as human. He felt more like a plant, nearly non-existent. As Blue Rainbow and Elder Gold began to stand to greet him, Shifeng gestured for them to remain seated, dispensing with the formalities. He then smiled and asked, "I've heard that you've conveyed my proposal to your respective guild leaders? How do your guilds wish to cooperate with Zero Wing?" Magic Flash and Old Forest inwardly rolled their eyes at Shifeng's question. His actions had practically engraved his words on their guild leaders' bones, and they'd remember them for the rest of their lives. Guild leader Black Flame, your proposal has delighted our guild leaders, and they have stated that as long as Zero Wing will waive the teleportation fees for our guild members, we will help the Candlelight trading firm establish itself in the Dark World's major NPC cities. What do you think? Blue Rainbow asked. Although their 2 guilds were reluctant to accept Shifeng's conditions, they had no choice with the situation weighing against them. If they declined, both of their guilds' positions would become more disadvantageous as time passed. Waive the teleportation fee? After giving the matter some thought, Shifeng said, "That's fine, but I'd like to set up a branch shop in every NPC city in the Dark World. Of course, Zero Wing will cover the necessary expenditures. Your 2 guilds only need to resolve the issue of land." Guild leader Black Flame, you are asking for the impossible. The Dark World is even larger than the main continent's ancient empires. While our guilds are 2 of the top 3 in the Dark World, we only control a small portion of the other world. We simply don't have the manpower and resources to ensure that Candlelight can operate in every NPC city, Elder Gold said, shaking his head with an unhappy smile. Dark Rhapsody, Deity Society, and world domination had a lot of influence on the surface, but the same couldn't be said for their control on the Dark World. In the Dark World, players had partial control of the various NPC cities. As long as a power controlled one of these cities, they wouldn't have to worry about needing funds or resources, and without these concerns, they didn't have to worry about offending the Otherworld's top 3 guilds. To put it simply, helping Candlelight secure branches in the Dark World's major NPC cities was a colossal challenge. Both guilds would have to pull a lot of strings to fulfill their end of the bargain. Unfortunately, helping the trading firm set up shops in every NPC city would be a dream. Even if world domination cooperated, the feat wouldn't be feasible. There is something else we need to inform you about, Guild leader Black Flame, Blue Rainbow said. Due to your actions at the teleportation gate, the Dark World's various major powers loathe Zero Wing. As a result, our guilds are risking much by allying with your guild. Moreover, Demon's Heart has traveled across the Dark World, secretly persuading the various powers to join its alliance. By the looks of it, they planned to challenge the ancient God's Tower in the Dark World. This ancient God's Tower is extraordinary, surviving since the Dark World's creation. There are rumors that it's connected to thousands of other worlds. Nobody had been able to clear the tower's trials yet, but as players grow stronger, the various powers will be able to activate a portion of it, if not all. If that happens, the various powers will reach the main continent, even without the teleportation gate. Only they will have to do so by passing through another otherworld. Aqua Rose and Gentle Snow, who stood behind Shifeng, frowned at the news. If what the female Dark Knight said was true, wouldn't that mean the effort they had put into capturing the teleportation gate would go to waste? The Ancient God's Tower? Shifeng had some recollection of this name. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. The Ancient God's Tower was connected to thousands of other worlds. It was also one of the reasons that the Dark World was considered a special otherworld in God's domain. However, since no power had taken control of the Dark World's teleportation gate in his past, none of the Dark World's powers had bothered to challenge the tower's trials. Activating the Ancient God's Tower was insanely difficult after all. Of course, while current players had no hope of fully activating the Ancient God's Tower, activating some of it should be possible. That's right. The Dark World's various powers have already turned their focus to the Ancient God's Tower, and Demon's Heart has quite a bit of resources and information relating to it. I'm afraid it won't be long before the various powers band together to challenge the tower, Blue Rainbow said, nodding. One darkness crystal per person was no trivial cost. No one would pay such a high fee unless necessary. What if I can help you secure the Ancient God's Tower within a short time? Shifeng asked. Chapter 2575, Crazy Choice. You'll help us secure the Ancient God's Tower? Shifeng's question stunned Blue Rainbow and Elder Gold. As long as you secure the Ancient God's Tower before anyone else, you'll have full control of the tower's teleportation array for a certain time, correct? Shifeng said. The Ancient God's Tower had a total of 7 floors, and each housed several teleportation arrays to different otherworlds. Some were even connected to resource-rich secret lands. The first player to conquer any of the floor's trials would become the floor's first floor master. Once a month, players could contest for the title. If Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society could conquer the Ancient God's Tower's first floor, they would have full control of that floor for the next month, and no one could leave the Dark World through the teleportation arrays during that time. Guild leader Black Flame, you might not be aware, but the Ancient God's Tower isn't like the Dark World's teleportation gate. Aside from the intense suppression non-dark players like yourself face in the Dark World, players are prohibited from using tools within the tower. NPCs cannot enter the tower either. Players will have to rely on their own strength and skills to clear the trials, Elder Gold said. He didn't doubt Zero Wing's strength, but the Ancient God's Tower was in the Dark World, where non-dark players wouldn't be able to exhibit their full strength. Including the ban on tools and NPCs, Zero Wing wouldn't accomplish anything in the tower. If it were so easy, Demon's Heart wouldn't have bothered to gather the Dark World's various powers in an attempt to conquer the tower and would have sought the help of the main continent's superpowers instead. The various superpowers certainly had the strength to trample the Dark World's various powers normally. That's right. Not only do the Ancient God's Tower's trials have a strict time limit, but we'll also need a minimum of 200 Tier 3 experts to clear them. Without enough players, we won't be able to handle the hordes of monsters within, not to mention capture the tower's cities. While our guilds can barely gather 200 Tier 3 experts, the first floor's trial is just as difficult as a level 100 super large-scale team dungeon. Our experts simply don't meet the weapon, equipment, skill and spell requirements, Blue Rainbow insisted, nodding. Their 2 guilds had considered raiding the Ancient God's Tower, but the feat was too difficult. No individual power in the Dark World could even clear the first floor's trial. Unfortunately, Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society no longer had the option of allying with other powers. After the Dark World's invading army had been defeated, Demon's Heart had exposed their guild's alliance with Zero Wing, instantly isolating them from the rest of the Dark World. As a result, both guilds were forced into deepening their relationship with Zero Wing. If they didn't, their guilds would be doomed once Demon's Heart and the Dark World's other powers conquered the Ancient God's Tower's first floor. Relax. That won't be a problem, Shifeng said, chuckling. However, I have an extra condition if we succeed. Shifeng knew far more about the ancient God's Tower than any player in God's domain, and as such he knew that the two guilds had no chance of success, even if they worked together. That was only true for the current Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society, however. Are you really that confident in our success, Guild Leader Black Flame? Blue Rainbow asked. She knew that Zero Wing had extraordinary Tier 3 experts, but the suppression regular players faced in the Dark World was nothing to ignore. Even ordinary Domain Realm experts would, at best, exhibit Void Realm combat standards. This was why the main continent's various superpowers had allied with the Dark World's powers, rather than invade the Otherworld. While I can't guarantee our success, I'm 70% to 80% confident, Shifeng replied. 80%? Elder Gold stuttered, his eyes going wide. If Shifeng hadn't personally captured the Dark World's teleportation gate, he would have assumed the swordsman was an escaped lunatic from a mental asylum. Even without the Dark World's suppression, the various superpowers wouldn't be guaranteed to conquer the ancient God's Tower's first floor. Even with its heaven-defying foundations, Zero Wing should at best have a 40% success rate. 70 or 80% was practically ensured victory. May I know of your conditions, Guild Leader Black Flame? Blue Rainbow asked after calming down. Although she didn't know whether or not Shifeng was telling the truth, Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society would only benefit if his plan succeeded. They had no reason to refuse. It's quite simple. I want 80% of the ancient God's Tower's profits. I also want the authority to manage your guild's main force members. In addition, my command will take precedence over your guild leaders during times of impending danger, Shifeng said after giving the matter some thought. This, Elder Gold could not help but hesitate. If Zero Wing helped them gain control over the ancient God's Tower, their guilds wouldn't mind splitting the profits. They could even accept only 20%, but giving up control of their main force members was absurd. Rest assured, I won't interfere with your main force's daily activities. They just need to follow orders when I need them, Shifeng said. Of course, you can return and take the time to consider my proposal. I don't need an answer right away. We have no need to consider the offer, Guild Leader Black Flame, Dark Rhapsody agrees. In return, Zero Wing must allow our members to travel through the teleportation gate freely. Of course, Dark Rhapsody will do its best to assist in establishing the Candlelight trading firm in the Dark World. Blue Rainbow abruptly interjected. Rainbow, are you insane? You're talking about the management rights for your guild's main force. Elder Gold asked as he stared at the female Dark Knight in shock. Agreeing to this condition was on par with handing Shifeng control of a fraction of Dark Rhapsody's backbone. Claiming that Shifeng would act as a partial guild leader was no exaggeration. I'm still sane. My guild leader impressed upon me the importance of cooperating with Zero Wing. Moreover, I don't think that Guild Leader Black Flame actually fancies our two guilds' main forces, Blue Rainbow informed Elder Gold via a whisper. Realization immediately dawned on the older man. Zero Wing no longer lacked manpower. With every moment, a ton of experts applied to join the guild, and Zero Wing now controlled the Dark World's teleportation gate. Until someone activated the ancient God's Tower, Zero Wing had a firm grasp on the Dark World's lifeline. In truth, even Shifeng was a little surprised. He hadn't expected Blue Rainbow to agree so decisively. Any other large guild's upper echelon would have likely turned and left in a huff. Deal. Deity Society will agree to your conditions as well, Guild Leader Black Flame. However, Deity Society wants the same conditions as Dark Rhapsody in return, Elder Gold said, sighing. Now that the Dark World's various powers recognized their guilds as Zero Wing's allies, they had no choice but to stick by Zero Wing until the very end. Moreover, an alliance with this guild would ensure that both Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society could develop far faster than their dark counterparts. That won't be a problem. Once we sign the contract, your guild's members may use the teleportation gate to their heart's content, Shifeng agreed, nodding. What do we do once the contract has been signed? Elder Gold asked. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. EU Demon's heart was already in a rush to find allies to conquer the ancient God's Tower. Once its team had enough Tier 3 experts, it would challenge the Tower's trials. Hence, Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society were running out of time. Simple. Send your main force members to Stone Forest City immediately. Zero Wing will take responsibility for their growth, Shifeng said, chuckling. Everything in God's domain boiled down to players' strength, including raiding team dungeons and the ancient God's Tower. As long as he could help the two guilds' main force members grow strong enough, raiding the tower wouldn't be an issue. Their growth. Shifeng's demand stunned Blue Rainbow. She had never thought he'd choose such an option. Where are we going? To the level 120 secret land, Poison City, Shifeng declared. Chapter 2576, Secret Land Exploration? When Shifeng stated his intentions to travel to a level 120 secret land, both Blue Rainbow and Elder Gold were speechless. The various superpowers hadn't even entered level 110,100-man team dungeons once. In fact, barely any players had reached level 110 yet. While secret lands weren't dungeons, they were even more dangerous. Even the safest secret land could rival super large-scale hard-mode team dungeons of the same level. Not even superpowers would dare suggest exploring a level 120 secret land. Yet Shifeng spoke of doing so as casually as if he were visiting the local market. For a moment, Blue Rainbow and Elder Gold doubted that they played the same game Shifeng did. What? Is there a problem? Shifeng curiously asked when he saw the two representatives' dazed expressions. No, it's nothing. Only Guild Leader Black Flame, we're talking about a level 120 secret land. I'm afraid that with our current levels and equipment, Elder Gold said worriedly, entering a level 120 secret land wouldn't be a problem. Even a level 1 player could do it. The problem was whether or not they could leave the secret land alive. Unlike dungeons, secret lands' difficulty and number of monsters weren't fixed, but randomized. If one were lucky, a 100-man team would be enough to survive. If not, they might need a team of 1,000 players or even 5,000 to make it out. This was why raiding secret lands proved much harder than raiding a team dungeon of the same level. Normally, guilds would mobilize a large fraction of their members to raid a secret land, but after level 100, only Tier 3 experts had any chance of surviving. Tier 2 experts would only hold them back. In other words, guilds couldn't use all of their available manpower to raid level 100+ secret lands. They'd have to rely on a small number of Tier 3 experts. This was precisely why the various major powers and superpowers hadn't bothered to raid level 100+ secret lands, even after crossing the level 100 threshold. Relax. As long as everyone follows my orders, we shouldn't have any major problems, Shifeng said. Chukto during his previous life, Poison City had been famous for how incredibly dangerous it was. Even when the various superpowers had dispatched a team of several thousand Tier 3 experts, they had failed to complete the raid. The various superpowers had only conquered the secret land after their experts had reached Tier 4. However, Shifeng had no intention of capturing Poison City. He only wanted the fragment of Solomon's sword that hid within. Moreover, he now had the fragmented legendary ranked Abyssal Blade and Ring of Gospel. The ring would be particularly helpful on this endeavor. Once he had become an intermediate master magician, he found he could amplify the Ring of Gospel's effects until it was even effective against Tier 4 monsters, which drastically increased his chances of obtaining the sword fragment. Now he only lacked numbers. Generally, one would need at least 1,000 Tier 3 experts to raid level 100+ secret lands, but even with the Hell Legion's 300 Tier 3 experts, he only had around 500 under his command. It was too risky to take such a small team into the secret land. However, if he included Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society's 200+ Tier 3 experts, he'd have a much higher chance of securing Solomon's sword's fragment. Something still felt off to Blue Rainbow and Elder Gold, but since they had already signed a contract with Shifeng, they couldn't go back on their word for no good reason. The two representatives then contacted their guilds, secretly gathering their Tier 3 experts. Meanwhile, Shifeng gathered Zero Wing's experts and the Hell Legion. In the Dark World, news of the alliance between Zero Wing, Dark Rhapsody, and Deity Society spread quickly. A commotion rose all across the Otherworld, and when the Dark World's many independent players learned that the two Dark Guilds members could use the teleportation gate for free, many of them began to apply. Elder Heart World Domination followed Demon's Heart's instructions to spearhead the attack against Zero Wing. And yet, the guild's reputation is in tatters, and it has become the Dark World's shame. To make matters worse, Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society have become incredibly popular after allying with Zero Wing. If you still can't offer anything substantial, we'll have to consider doing the same, Dawn Dominance coldly informed Furious Heart, who sat across from him in the reception room. Please rest assured, Guild Leader Dawn. We are responsible for inviting world domination into this situation, and we won't let your guild suffer for it. Don't you want to take revenge against Zero Wing, Guild Leader Dawn? Furious Heart asked. Not only does Zero Wing possess the popular Stone Forest City, but it has also taken control of the Dark World's teleportation gate. It stands in the limelight on the eastern continent, but the nail that sticks out gets hammered down. Many superpowers currently find Zero Wing's popularity to be irksome. I want something practical, not empty promises. Dawn Dominance growled, rolling his eyes. He understood Furious Heart's logic, but the problem was that no one could do anything to Zero Wing right now. However, the problem was that nobody was capable of doing anything against Zero Wing right now. We have quietly received funding from quite a few superpowers. We've also secured a loan of weapons and equipment. If World Domination is willing to join our alliance, we'll lend you 50 sets of level 105 fine gold equipment and 10 sets of dark gold equipment for 10 days without cost, Furious Heart calmly stated, smiling. How about it? Even ordinary superpowers have a hard time acquiring such equipment, but World Domination can borrow it by joining our alliance. With these sets, your guild can raid level 100 team dungeons, obtaining even more top-tier weapons and equipment. In addition, once we've captured the Ancient Gods Tower, World Domination will receive 5% of the tower's shares. It's a much better offer than what Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society accepted from Zero Wing, don't you think? 50 sets of level 105 fine gold equipment and 10 sets of level 105 dark gold equipment? The terms of Furious Heart's deal astonished Dawn Dominance. You can get your hands on so much top-tier equipment? Although he knew that the outcome of the war had enraged Demon's Heart and the outside world superpowers, he had never dreamed they would go to such lengths to deal with Zero Wing. With that much top-tier equipment, he could arm an incredibly powerful 100-man team. Even raiding level 100 super large-scale team dungeons and level 110 mythic field bosses would be possible, not to mention level 100,000 100-man team dungeons. What had their goal been in heading to Cold Spring Forest? To obtain better weapons and equipment as well as rapidly rising through the levels? If they had enough top-tier weapons and equipment, would leveling and securing more still be a problem? Don't concern yourself with that, Guild Leader Dawn. Just sign the contract and we'll hand the equipment over immediately, Furious Heart urged, chuckling. Deal. I'll agree to your offer. Dawn Dominance declared. Very well. I'll contact my vice guild leader immediately. You'll have the weapons and equipment promised within half a day, Furious Heart said, not surprised in the least by Dawn Dominance's reaction. Only a fool would refuse such an offer. After signing the contract, Furious Heart left World Domination's residence and returned to Demon City. Is everything settled? Flaming Light raised his head and asked as Furious Heart entered his office. It's done. The Dark World's various powers have agreed to join our alliance. We can raid the Ancient Gods Tower at any time, Furious Heart reported. Good. Flaming Light nodded, satisfied. Smiling, he continued, Zero Wing must assume I'm helpless now that it controls the Dark World's teleportation gate. Unfortunately, Zero Wing is unaware that its actions have only earned more loathing and anger. Zero Wing had no background, yet it sat on a mountain of wealth and resources. One could even say that it had monopolized all of the Dark World's resources. Naturally, the various superpowers wouldn't let the guild get away with it. Hence, without lifting a finger, plenty of superpowers and corporations had approached him, declaring their intentions to supply all sorts of resources in exchange for dragging Zero Wing down from its pedestal. As long as Demon's Heart secured the Ancient Gods Tower, it would usher in dark times for Zero Wing. If Zero Wing had obediently accepted defeat, it would have only lost Cold Spring Forest, but now it would lose everything. The guild's night division was limited to Cold Spring Forest after all. Elsewhere, Shifeng had reached Poison City alongside Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society's main force members. The moment the Dark players set foot in the secret land, they shuddered. Black fog covered the land, and they felt as if they were walking on clouds as they stepped into it. They also felt suddenly cold and hungry, and their 5 senses and reaction speeds had weakened. Here they wouldn't be able to exhibit half of their usual combat power. However, the dark fog wasn't the worst part. They were far more afraid of the level 115+ monsters that roamed the forest outside of Poison City. Even the weakest monster here was a High Lord, and many were Great Lord and Grand Lord ranked wandering souls. These monsters had once been members of the army that guarded Poison City before the black fog had devoured them. The closer they got to these monsters, the more the corrosive energy in the area affected them. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Sure enough, there are a lot of monsters here. Shifeng was similarly astonished when he saw the wandering souls nearby. Not only did the secret land house far more monsters than during his previous life, but the death energy that enveloped the area was also denser. Of course, that wasn't enough to deter him from exploring the secret land, and he turned to Kola and the others. Start luring monsters, but not too many at once. 500 or 600 will be enough. Shifeng's command rendered Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society's members speechless. They were sure they'd be annihilated if they took on 100 monsters at a time, let alone 500. The death energy in this map was simply too powerful, and all of these monsters were level 115 or higher. Trying to fight 500 or 600 simultaneously was suicide. Okay. However, Kola, Fire Dance and the others remained unfazed. They immediately dashed into the forest on their own and began to attract the wandering souls aggro. Chapter 2577. Difference of level 120. Frightening wealth. As Kola, Fire Dance and the others darted through the silent forest, they caused a commotion. Small groups of wandering souls flew toward the offending players, quickly surrounding them. These monsters were so fast that ordinary experts wouldn't have a chance to escape. However, the encirclement was practically non-existent to Kola and Zero Wing's other MTs. Like unstoppable tanks, they charged through the monsters, shoving aside any that stood in their path with their shields. None of the wandering souls could stop their advance. Meanwhile, Fire Dance and the other more agile players maneuvered their way around the wandering souls, letting none lay a hand on them. The death energy the wandering souls exuded had no effect on Kola, Fire Dance or their companions. It almost seemed like some kind of invisible barrier protected them from the death energy's corrosion. In no time at all, Kola and the others had pulled around 600 monsters toward the rest of the team. Wandering Soul. Undead High Lord. Level 115 HP 45, 000, 000/45, 000, 000, Elite Wandering Soul. Undead Great Lord. Level 116 HP 120, 000, 000/120, 000, 000, Crazed Soul. Undead Grand Lord. Level 116 HP 400, 000, 000/400, 000, 000, facing the 400+ Wandering Souls, 100+ Elite Wandering Souls, and 6 Crazed Souls. Everyone on the team couldn't help but shudder. Unlike ordinary monsters, these wandering souls had once been Poison City's warriors. Even in death, they retained the skills they had used in life. When several hundred wandering souls gathered, they actually formed a battle array, and although it wasn't very strong, it significantly boosted the monster's movement speed and reaction speed. A faint layer of mana had also appeared around the monsters, strengthening their defense and the power of their skills and spells. However, the team was even more surprised to find that these wandering souls didn't employ simple pack tactics like ordinary monsters. Rather, they moved in proper formation. The wandering souls with shields and melee weapons moved to the front of the group, while those with bows and staves stood in the back. The small force gradually and orderly advanced. So, this is a level 120 secret land? Blue Rainbow was shocked as she watched the monsters march like a uniform army. Although she had known that level 100+ secret lands were extraordinary, she couldn't help her surprise as she experienced it for herself. These monsters were already a major challenge since their basic attributes were higher than players of the same tier and level. They also had far more HP and defense. Now that they could fight with as much organization as NPCs, their combat power would drastically increase. If their team hadn't had the numerical advantage, they wouldn't have stood a chance. Even Hell Rush frowned at the incoming force. Normally, the Hell Legion's experts wouldn't have any problems fighting these monsters one-on-one. Not even the Grand Lord-ranked Crazed Souls would be too much for the Hell Legion to overcome, but now these monsters had their own battle array. Not only did this battle array boost the Wandering Souls' physical performance, but it also drastically reduced the number of weak points they had. Including the monster's level advantage, even the Hell Legion was in for a tough battle without the help of weapons and equipment with the Ignore levels attribute. Only Shifeng seemed unaffected by Poison City's formidable monsters. This was the true combat power of God's Domain's monsters. All monsters before level 115 were merely obstacles to help players get used to the game. Once players neared the level 120 threshold, however, God's Domain no longer catered to its players. Instead, players had to adapt to God's Domain. Monsters would begin to behave like living beings with their own characteristics. If players couldn't take advantage of these characteristics, even experts of the same tier would fall in a one-on-one fight. This was why level 120 secret lands and team dungeons were true treasure troves for tier 3 players, containing all sorts of ancient inheritances, skill and spell books. As the Undead Legion approached, Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society's players mentally prepared themselves for a hard fight. Meanwhile, Shifeng retrieved the Ring of Gospel and spent 5,000 magic crystals to activate Miniature World. The Phantom World descended, and the Undead Legion's basic attributes fell rapidly. Their reaction speed and physique also plummeted. The Dark players on the team were stupefied. They had experienced the Ring of Gospel's power before, but they were still as shocked as they had been the first time. A moment ago their senses had warned them that these undead were powerful opponents, but now the monsters seemed relatively easy to defeat. They couldn't help but feel grateful that Shifeng stood on their side, not against them. Alright, let's end this battle quickly, Shifeng commanded when he realized most of his team was still dazed. The Ring of Gospel was indeed an amazing tool, but it was incredibly costly. Just maintaining Miniature World for 10 minutes cost 5,000 magic crystals. Shifeng's command shook everyone from their stupor, and they began to activate skills and spells against the incoming legion. Now that they had the advantage in basic attributes, the quickest and simplest way to victory was to face these wandering souls head-on. When the first volley of Tier 3 skills and spells landed, the ground and nearby forest shook violently. The bombardment even transformed the terrain around them. After 10 minutes, over 80% of the Undead Legion had fallen, and the few survivors only had scant amounts of HP remaining. Even without Miniature World suppression, the team could rely on their overwhelming numerical advantage to eliminate the remaining monsters. During the fight, everyone on the team was able to experience what it felt like to face a true monster the main god system had designed. The main god system hadn't restrained the wandering souls in the slightest, and they had incredible control of the death energy wafting off them. If players did not learn how to manipulate their own mana to defend themselves, the death energy would quickly corrode and influence their bodies. Normally, this learning process would be incredibly dangerous. If players failed to defend themselves, the corrosion would temporarily paralyze them. An instant death wouldn't be surprising in that case. Fortunately, the team had more than just an overwhelming numerical advantage. The monsters before them were at death's door, and as a result their combat power had dropped slightly. Hence they posed far less of a threat. Every player on the team was a Tier 3 expert, with far greater talent and combat standards than ordinary players. Although they had only experienced such combat for a short time, they had all gained a newfound understanding of mana control and their mana bodies. However, the team was far more surprised to see how much EXP they earned from the slain wandering souls. The monsters granted such abundant EXP that even Blue Rainbow and Elder Gold were shocked. Every member of the team saw a significant rise in their experience bars after just defeating around 600 wandering souls. Some players even rose from level 107 to 108. Their leveling speed here was at least 10 times faster than in the outside world. Moreover, the monsters had dropped a bunch of loot. Items were scattered across the entire battlefield. These monsters' drop rate was more than double that of monsters in the outside world, particularly when it came to weapons and equipment. Even the weakest piece of equipment was level 115 Mysterious Iron rank, and 6 pieces of level 115 Secret Silver equipment had dropped. For a while the Dark players had bloodshot eyes. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. To them, level 115 Mysterious Iron equipment might be subpar, but level 115 Secret Silver equipment was incredibly precious. So long as they equipped level reduction gemstones, they could arm themselves with level 115 Secret Silver equipment after reaching level 110. Naturally, level 115 Secret Silver equipment was slightly better than level 110 Fine Gold equipment. Due to equipment's low drop rate, the various powers were going mad in their search for level 105 fine gold equipment. They could only dream of level 110 fine gold items. Now, after fighting for less than 15 minutes, their team had obtained 6 pieces of level 115 secret silver equipment. If they grinded here for a full day, their harvest would be astronomical. While Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society's members envied Zero Wing over so much loot, Fire Dance, who was responsible for collecting the items, excitedly ran up to Shifeng. Guild leader, it dropped. Chapter 2578, Frightening Zero Wing. As Fire Dance approached with a tattered old tome, Shifeng's eyes widened in surprise. What? Dropped just like that? The monsters wandering around Poison City had a chance of dropping 2 support items when killed, and both were worth thousands of gold. However, no one would willingly part with either support item, even when offered a level 100 plus epic item. One of the 2 items was an ancient potion while the other was a mana battle array. The ancient potion in question could accelerate the process of unlocking players' mana bodies, while permanently improving their mana control. With this potion, even ordinary Tier 3 players could unlock their mana body's full potential within 2 months. On the other hand, the mana battle array was even more astounding. Normally, battle arrays had to be engraved into players' equipment, meaning that once players replaced their battle array equipment, they'd lose the battle array. However, players could directly learn the mana battle array found in Poison City. Hence, they wouldn't have to worry about losing the array when they switched to new equipment. Players could use it forever. The mana battle array required a minimum of 12 players to activate. Once active, not only would it increase the mana density around players, but players' basic attributes would rise as well. Most importantly, the battle array would form a layer of mana armor around players, increasing their magic resistance and resistance to foreign energies' corrosion. The tome in Fire Dance's hand was none other than the mana battle array. It was no wonder she was so ecstatic. As the mana battle array was akin to a skill, it could be used where tools were prohibited, such as many of God's domain's level 100 plus maps and team dungeons. In these locations, the mana battle array was practically invaluable. In the past, the various powers would spend more than 2 weeks grinding near Poison City without obtaining a single mana battle array, and yet one had just dropped from a single wave of wandering souls. The current drop rate was astounding. When Hell Rush and the others saw the mana battle array's information, they couldn't help but feel a little jealous. With a complete set, one could increase a team's overall strength to a whole new level. The mana battle array would be especially helpful when teams explored certain maps or dungeons and didn't meet the equipment requirements. That tome was even more valuable than level 115 top-tier weapons and equipment. Now that they knew the Wandering Souls could drop something as awesome as the mana battle array, Zero Wing's members were overcome with fighting spirit. Kola and the others immediately split away from the main team to lure more Wandering Souls. Moreover, they now knew that the team could easily handle 600 Wandering Souls with the Ring of Gospel's assistance, and so they decided to gather even more monsters to maximize the ring's effects. After a short moment, Kola and his comrades ran toward the team with nearly 800 Wandering Souls trailing behind them. Seeing this, the team's members sharpened their focus and prepared for battle. Over the next 3 days, the team restlessly grinded on the Wandering Souls roaming the forest around Poison City. After 3 days, every member of the team had gained 5 levels. Fire Dance, Kola, and the other Zero Wing members had reached level 114, while Shifeng had reached level 115. Meanwhile, Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society's members had reached level 112 and 113. Their levels would even shock the various superpowers. The dark players on the team wished they could stay in Poison City forever. Leveling 5 times in 3 days was unheard of, especially at their levels. Normally, they'd be lucky to level up once every 5 days. No one would believe them if they told them. Meanwhile, Blue Rainbow and Elder Gold finally understood why Shifeng was so confident about helping them conquer the ancient god's tower. This leveling speed was simply maddening. Furthermore, fighting these monsters had helped them rapidly improve their combat standards. What Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society's members didn't know was that Shifeng had spent an astronomical number of magic crystals to make this 3-day grind possible. He had arrived with 600,000 magic crystals in his bag, but now he had less than 50,000 remaining. Moreover, he had used miniature worlds sparingly. Otherwise he would have blown through all 600,000 crystals by now. Of course, the bounty he received in return was amazing. During the past 3 days he had obtained over 700 pieces of level 115 secret silver equipment and over 5,000 pieces of level 115 mysterious iron equipment. He could easily earn back the cost of this grind by selling the mysterious iron equipment. He had also acquired a total of 87 level 115 fine gold weapons and equipment. Of course, Shifeng had no intention of selling any of the weapons or equipment that had dropped. Rather, he'd make them available to his guildmates. After embedding a level reduction gemstone into every weapon and equipment piece, he distributed them among Blue Frost and Zero Wing's other members from Shelter 1, providing a massive boost to their basic attributes. Now their attributes were even higher than the Hell Legion's experts. Even in Netherworld Empire, the Hell Legion's members were experts among experts. Every one of them wore level 105 fine gold equipment, with some wearing dark gold ranked items. Their equipment standards even ranked at the top compared to the various superpowers experts, yet it was 2 whole ranks weaker than the items Blue Frost and his team wore. Of course, Shifeng did not mistreat the Hell Legion, granting the Legion members a portion of the level 115 secret silver equipment. After all, he had a contract with Netherworld Empire, which required him to keep the Hell Legion's equipment up to date. Furthermore, the Hell Legion's members had incredible combat standards. Better equipment would only help them exhibit even more combat power. Aside from weapons and equipment, Shifeng had obtained plenty of valuable items. He now had a total of 46 mana battle arrays and over 80 bottles of the ancient potion. He had also secured over 100 tier 3 skill and spell books. Combined, all of these items were even more valuable than the weapons and equipment that had dropped near Poison City. Rather than letting these precious items collect dust in his bag, he distributed them among the team as he had with the weapons and equipment. However, he had chosen 46 Zero Wing members to learn the mana battle arrays. He also decided to give the 50+ Zero Wing members who had entered the Truth Realm 1 ancient potion each. He passed the majority of the remaining 20+ bottles to the Hell Legion, Dark Rhapsody's Blue Rainbow, and Deity Society's Elder Gold. "We get a share too?" Blue Rainbow asked as Shifeng handed her the potion. The ancient potion permanently improved players' mana control and helped them unlock their mana bodies. Unless one were a fool, they'd recognize how valuable the ancient potion was. Its drop rate was only so high now because they were pioneering Poison City. The drop rate would certainly drop to abysmal lows once this period was over. If it were up to her, she wouldn't share any of the potions with outsiders. "Of course. I already told you that I'm going to help you grow stronger," Shifeng said, nodding. If these were members of other guilds, he wouldn't even give them the ancient potion's remnants. However, the Hell Legion, Dark Rhapsody, and Deity Society were different. They were Zero Wing's allies. It was a pity that the ancient potion's drop rate was so low, and he couldn't afford to give away too many. Otherwise, he would have given Dark Rhapsody and Deity Society more of Zero Wing's share. The monsters they were currently fighting were the weakest in the Poison City's outer reaches. He would have to travel deeper into the secret land if he wanted to obtain the fragment of Solomon's sword. Hence, he decided to help those with high combat standards first. Both Blue Rainbow and Elder Gold were on the cusp of reaching the domain realm. If they grew stronger, they could provide a huge boost to the team's overall combat power. The team's dark players grew excited when they heard Shifeng's reply. They hadn't expected to receive any of the ancient potions, but knowing they could earn a small slice of the pie was definitely worth celebrating. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. Guild leader, I found the sealed sword you mentioned inside the city. Fire Dance suddenly reported in the team chat while everyone rested. But what? Shifeng prodded. The fragment of Solomon's sword was inside Poison City. To be precise, it was sealed within the city. If players wanted to claim it, they wouldn't have to go as far as conquering Poison City. They merely need to undo the seal on the sword fragment. Of the fragments Shifeng had yet to obtain, this was the easiest to acquire. After all, this so-called fragment was only a level 100 epic weapon. Solomon's sword was very powerful, but to reach that power, one would have to reproduce it with all 5 of its fragments. This was why the weapon was so hard to reproduce. Even after obtaining 4 fragments, all players would have was 4 epic weapons. Some might not even realize that their epic weapon was, in fact, a fragment of Solomon's sword. But there's a Tier 5 Sword Saint and 2 Tier 4 NPCs guarding the sword. Chapter 2579, Crimson-Eyed Sword Saint. Upon hearing Fire Dance's report, Shifeng fell silent for a very long time. What was going on? NPCs? 1 Tier 5 NPC and 2 Tier 4 NPCs at that? According to his information, Poison City had no such NPCs. It was a city of the dead. No living creatures could survive in this secret land. Should we retreat, guild leader? Fire Dance asked. They might not have a problem with Tier 4 NPCs. With their numerical advantage and the Ring of Gospels effects, they might stand a chance against 2 Tier 4 NPCs, but trying to take on a Tier 5 Sword Saint was a joke. A Tier 5 Sword Saint was an apex being in the current god's domain. Not even kingdoms would dare to offend such an individual. And a Tier 5 Sword Saint could slay Tier 3 players as easily as chopping vegetables. A Tier 5 NPC's combat standards were no trivial matter. They could even contend with Void Realm experts. To deal with a Tier 5 NPC, they'd need several dozen fully armed Tier 4 experts to stand a chance. No, wait there for now. We'll come find you, Shifeng said, shaking his head. He was most confident of obtaining the fragment of Solomon's sword within Poison City. He had almost no information on the rest. Thus, there was no way he'd leave without getting a good look at this fragment. At this stage of the game, only he had a Solomon's sword fragment. If he didn't take advantage of his chance to claim the rest before others, obtaining the fragments would be as challenging as finding a needle in a haystack. These fragments didn't have a mechanism to detect other fragments. Unless the players that obtained a fragment advertised the weapon, he wouldn't know where to find them. This was why he was in such a hurry. Getting his hands on the sword fragments was relatively easy right now, but as players reached higher levels, doing so would become increasingly difficult. This was why legendary items had been so extraordinarily rare in his past, particularly legendary weapons. Collecting the necessary fragments to reproduce the true item was too much of a challenge. A lot of manpower wasn't enough. One would have to be particularly lucky. Of course, there was an exception to this rule. Players could rely on ancient tomes. With these tomes in hand, players could search through God's Domain's database for any information they desired. However, ancient tomes were almost as rare as legendary weapons, and again one would have to get lucky to find one. After roughly 2 hours, the team of Dark players, the Hell Legion and Zero Wings members reached the plaza. Within its center stood a dried fountain. If one examined the fountain closely, they'd discover a faintly glowing magic array, which suppressed the dull gray longsword half buried in the fountain. Even with the magic array's suppression, the dull sword sapped away any life around it, turning the city into a land of death. It was clear that the sword's influence would be even more astonishing without the magic array to bind it. 3 NPCs stood around the dull gray sword in silence, and at the lead was a one-eyed, red-headed man wearing a snowy white cap. Alvos, Crimson-Eyed Sword Saint. Human Sword Saint. Level? HP? / Prep. A titled Sword Saint. Shifeng felt lightheaded when he saw the one-eyed man. Tier 5 titled NPCs were like kings among Tier 5 NPCs. They were responsible for miraculous feats in God's domain. In the past, not even a Tier 5 domain realm expert would dare offend a Tier 5 titled NPC. Only Tier 5 heroes could contend with these individuals, but unlike heroes, titled NPCs weren't powerful due to their extraordinary basic attributes, but their superior combat standards and explosive combat power. Because of this, players were more willing to face a Tier 5 hero than a Tier 5 titled NPC. And now, Shifeng stared at such an individual in Poison City, a level 120 secret land. Shifeng's teammates gasped when they noticed Alvos. Even within imperial capitals, they had never seen such an NPC. If they became that man's enemy, their fates would be sealed and they might even have to delete their accounts, starting all over. As Shifeng hesitated on whether or not he should continue his personal mission for Solomon's sword's fragment, Alvos turned and looked at the wall his team hid behind. "You've been watching for long enough. Show yourselves," Alvos calmly demanded. The moment the Crimson-Eyed Sword Saint spoke, everyone felt an unprecedented pressure bear down on them. Blue Rainbow and Elder Gold struggled against their instincts, which screamed at them to flee. They could feel just how powerful this NPC was. If they made him unhappy, Alvos could render all of the progress they've made in God's domain useless. Such incidents had happened more than once in the Dark World before, and that was precisely why the other world's Dark players didn't dare to offend or casually approach Tier 5 NPCs. In fact, most players actively avoided Tier 4 NPCs. Don't move. Shifeng suddenly shouted in the team chat. But Guild Leader Black Flame, that's a Tier 5 NPC, Elder Gold said. They weren't in an NPC city, and NPCs in the fields were especially unpredictable. The slightest mistake could lead to an unspeakable disaster. I know, but he's already discovered us. He won't let us get away if we try to run, Shifeng said, offering Elder Gold a bitter smile. Our best option is to do as he says. Never try to provoke a Tier 5 titled NPC. Not a single player in God's domain had a better idea of the power a Tier 5 titled NPC wielded. Once such an NPC discovered them, there was no chance for escape. Not even Tier 5 domain realm experts were guaranteed to outrun a Tier 5 titled NPC. Moreover, Alvo's movement wasn't restricted as the demon god's phantom had been. If this man willed it, Shifeng would die before he could even activate space movement or spatial gate. I understand. With the warning ringing in his ears, Elder Gold abandoned any thought of fleeing. As Shifeng had said, a Tier 5 NPC's movement speed wasn't to be underestimated. Moreover, NPCs gain the ability to fly after reaching Tier 4. How could Tier 3 players like themselves possibly hope to outrun such a being? Moreover, the Tier 5 Sword Saint would view any attempt to flee as a challenge to his authority. The outcome of committing such an offense would be far graver than approaching the NPC directly. Under Shifeng's lead, the team emerged from the small alley that had provided cover and approached the crimson-eyed Sword Saint. Greetings, esteemed Sword Saint. We are here to explore this secret land and accidentally discovered this place. Please forgive us for our trespass. Shifeng respectfully apologized to Elvos, who currently sat before the fountain. Exploring this secret land? Elvos smiled. The NPC's tone then turned chilly as he continued. You've come for this sword, right? Well, who commands your force? Killing intent. This was the killing intent of a bona fide Tier 5 titled NPC. Read latest chapters at Wuxia World. When Elvos' tone had chilled, Shifeng and all of his team felt the pressure on them increase. They all felt as if lead weights had been tied to their limbs and everyone struggled to breathe. It felt as if they had plunged into an icy hell. At the same time, they heard a series of system notifications. System, warning. Warning. System, you have triggered the epic event, Crimson Wrath. System, you have 30 seconds to make a decision. Kill Elvos, the crimson-eyed Sword Saint, or accept the punishment of death.